If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, hunters, campers, and other woods people. What are the strangest, creepiest things you've experienced in the forests and deep woods? Years ago, I was at a friend's 16th birthday with about 20 other people. They owned a huge property with something like 10 acres of woodland behind it. This is in Australia. In the middle of the night, we decided it would be fun to play murder in the dark in the woods. Me and my mate grabbed a ladder, thinking we would climb a tree and pull it up behind us, and no one would ever find us. So we're stomping through the bush, lugging this ladder with us, while we can hear the person who was at counting to 100. All of a sudden everything goes quiet around us, insects stop, there is no wind, etc. Even the counting sounded muted, and we start hearing this rhythmic thumping sound, something like a galloping horse coming from somewhere in front of us. As we're sitting there puzzled by the sound, it starts to get louder and closer, and we both swear we started to see a light coming through the trees in front of us. At that point, we ditched the ladder and bolted back the way we came. When we got out of the woods, we told everyone what we saw or heard, and my friend's dad told us to go get his ladder back, so off we went, all 20 of us, into the woods with torches, retracing our steps. We found the ladder. It was perfectly set up, just sitting in a small clearing and soaking wet. To this day, we still can't explain it and haven't tried to go out into the woods at night again. My friend and I used to go cycling in the woods every weekend and summer when we were younger, around the ages of 10 to 13. The woodland near where I live, suburbs of London, is ancient and has a lot of history, especially with old ruinous manors from medieval times dotted around. We have so many happy memories from that period, but one really peculiar and scary evening stands out. One evening, we went deep into the woods and checked out this old abandoned farm where there were these huge pine trees in the center of the field. We had to hop a couple fences to reach these trees, and there was always something majestic about these isolated trees in a field. Anyway, when we left the field, it must have been around 7 o'clock, as it was still a crystal blue sky. In England, it doesn't get dark until about 9 or 10 in the summer. I remember we both had this unbelievable sense of dread and panic that came over us, so we cycled off as fast as we could towards the exit, which was a tunnel into the back road. This was only a 5-minute cycle from the field with the isolated pine trees. However, my friend disappeared, and it felt like within a matter of minutes it was pitch black. I remember waiting at the entrance of the tunnel for my friend, as I was too scared to go through it alone, and it felt like I was waiting for hours. He turned up eventually, and he had no explanation as to where he had gone. Essentially, it felt as though 2 to 3 hours had been compressed into 5 minutes, and daylight turned to dusk with a flick of a switch. To this day, I have no explanation as to what the sensation we felt was or how time seemed to warp. Those woods have always had an eerie and mystical feel about them. I grew up in North Texas, south of Fort Worth. We lived in a small town, whose name I will not mention. Initially, we lived in the town proper, which had plenty of weirdness. I could tell a lot of stories from the locals about strange goings-on. Every once in a while, the town would be blanketed in a thick fog. And people always acted strangely about it, but it wasn't until we moved out of town into a newly built subdivision along the highway that I really got it. The fog was so dense that we couldn't see the light of the town or the factories a couple miles away. It was just pitch black, and occasionally we couldn't even see the street light at the end of the cul-de-sac. The first time the fog rolled in while we lived there, I sat on the front porch, just enjoying the dark and the quiet. Until the noises started. A couple streets over, I could hear what sounded like a small dog being torn to shreds. I heard them take a cat next. I would have assumed it was coyotes. I'd heard them take pets before, except there was no accompanying chorus of howls. Just the sound of animals in pain. I still get chills just thinking about it. It happened every time the fog rolled in, as long as I lived there. Last fall, while elk hunting, my son and his wife went up one ridge while I, by myself, went up a ridge across to the west of them. We were probably a mile or more apart in heavy timber. I got to the top, where I could see away, where it had logged a few years ago. I'm sitting in a good spot where I can see down both sides and along the ridge. I'd been there for maybe half an hour when I heard 3 loud knocks that echoed down the mountain to the southeast. I didn't really think much of it. Then, after another 10 minutes, there's 3 more knocks, this time closer. Now I'm wondering what it could be. After about 5 more minutes and 3 more knocks, they are close, just out of sight. I'm like, what in the hell? My hairs on my arms are standing on end. All of a sudden, I hear voices. I can't make out what they are saying, but there's more than one person talking. They are getting a bit closer, and I still can't see anything. They are maybe 100 yards or so down the hill. I could now hear a little better, but it sounds like a foreign language or something. It sounded like coughs, snorts, and grunts mixed with some sort of language. Now I'm on my feet, looking to see what's down there. It's starting to get dusk, and the light is dimming slowly. I see some movement to the south on the ridge. And there I was, watching a larger, dark-haired figure crossing the ridge. It was huge on two legs and moving at a good pace. Its head is set low on its neck, with the chin down near its chest. There was no hair around the eyes and nose. The nose was like ours, it didn't stick out far but was big. The arms were long, like the knees. The shoulders were wide, I'd guess between 3.5 and 4 feet across. The hair was probably 6 to 8 inches long and dark. I'd guess this thing to be between 8 and 10 feet tall. I put my scope on it before it disappeared. I could see the muscles in its legs and back moving. I just couldn't shoot, it just looked too damn human. I never saw the other one, but I believe it was watching me. I heard movement a few times as I made my way back to the rig. Then I had to wait in the dark for what seemed like forever before my boy got to the rig. They heard the knocks but couldn't tell what it was. We went back the next morning and couldn't find anything other than a sign of something heavy going on. This wasn't my first rodeo where Sasquatch was concerned. I saw one back in the early 80s from several hundred yards. And my wife and I had one run across the road in front of us in a snowstorm back in the mid-80s. It was white with a pinkish red face. But this time I heard them talking. I wish I would have gotten this on camera. I've never heard anything like it before. But I was on the internet one day and found a recording from California that was very similar in sound. I have had trail cameras set up in the area since the snow came off, but nothing yet. When I was 17, my buddy and I were on an elk hunt and got the hell scared out of us by something. The hunt was over, and we were walking back to the quads on a frozen creek. It was a full moon with snow on the ground, and you could see it as clear as day. Something huge ran up to us in the creekside willows, all we could make out was a dark shape. We ran for our lives, it followed us almost 3 kilometers along the creek until we broke to a clearing where our bikes were. It wouldn't come out of the trees, but it was cracking branches and making crazy sounds. Nothing human could have kept up to us in that thick-ass bush, we were running on the ice. This happened in mid-November in northern Alberta, and both of us refused to go back to those woods. Me and my dad were hunting a pipeline once. There was a 2-kilometer walk to a spot that we thought would be a prime whitetail area, turned out to be a complete bust, but anyway, we were walking back on the path, side by side. And for some reason, it sounded like there were 3 sets of walks. It seemed like someone was following us. We would stop, and so would the noise, so that wasn't very fun. We continued to stop and listen almost every 2 minutes, just in case. My dad was ahead of me with his 300 short since he was trying to get a late season moose, and I had my 243 Ruger for my deer. He was 10 feet ahead of me because I kept looking behind me and was getting slowed down by it. Where the path starts or where we had to exit through is 2 giant bushes on each side, so you can only see the path once you walk through them. He walked through, and I looked behind me one last time, except the footsteps never stopped like they did before. Now I was scared because bears were in hibernation around this time, and it was too small to be a moose. They slowly got closer and closer until I finally just climbed through the bushes. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I swear I heard from the other side of the bushes a whispering voice say, "Come back. Me and Dad are never going back there again." I'm only 16 now, and that was this past season. I know this will probably sound fake, but whenever I tell people what I saw, they usually try to debunk it. Anyways, my cousin, X, and I decided to go randonauting, and for those who don't know, it's like an app where you think and say out loud what you're intending to find, and the app will give you coordinates that relate to your intentions. Well, it was our first time after hearing stories and articles on the internet about it. Since it was getting darker, we decided to ask for something spooky. Well, it took us to this house 10 minutes away, and the porch had multiple dolls. Rag dolls, porcelain dolls, some hanging, and some sitting on things like tables and chairs. I remember being so scared that I told my ex to drive off in case anyone crazy came out of the house. Well, my cousin thought it was a good idea to do one more before going home, and again, we asked for something spooky. It took us to a lake, but on your way to the lake, there is a long street with woods on both sides. The way the coordinates were set, we had to park the car on the side of the road, and it specially told us to walk into the woods at a specific spot. So we walked up to the spot, and we noticed that the tall grass in that specific area looked stepped on, like it was flat compared to the rest of the area, and it aligned almost perfectly with the GPS. That alone gave me goosebumps, but my cousin was playing around and going deeper in. We heard some voices, like a group of people in the far distance, that spooked us so much that we just booked it. started sprinting to the car. My ex drove off, and we basically had to drive to the lake to do a U-turn back home, but as I looked back, I saw a tall black figure. Almost like 6 feet tall, and there were fireflies everywhere, so the figure was more visible to me, and I saw it turn to face us, and I saw what seemed to be glowing eyes. I grew up Christian, so I do believe in demons, ghosts, and such, but this was the first time I ever saw something of that nature. I got overcome by such fear that I started crying, and my cousin was shaking and told me he saw it too. It's been years, and I still think about it from time to time. Many of my friends have always told me that maybe it was just the fireflies, but I specifically remember that the eyes did not flicker like the rest, and I saw the head turning, so it was realistic in the sense of how you start seeing someone's eyes as they turn to face you. And I decided to tell my story and see if anyone has ever had the same experience. The first day of rifle season is up in the Poconos State Game Lands. Get settled on the downslope of a wooded, rocky hill, staring down towards a creek. Get into the analyze every tree phase of not seeing anything boredom. See a group of 3 trees about 18 apart from one another in a triangle. There's a couple of boulders wedged between them, about 6 off the ground. Each of the rocks had to be upwards of 150 pounds each, but I'm a terrible estimator, so whatever. They were stacked flat on top of one another. It was impressive. I took a picture. At about 1 p.m., we decide to meet back at the trucks and hit another site. On the walk back, I tell my hunting buddies about the rocks. I show them the picture. They want to see. Go back, find my spot, and look at where the trees and rocks were. Trees were there, but rocks were not. Nothing matching them was in the immediate area. Not spooky, not scary, but definitely strange. I lived in Kingsport, Tennessee, in middle school. My family had a half-acre plot that led back into acres of random woods and hills. There were cabins, dirt roads, and even churches back there that were not on any map. Some were abandoned, but many had people living in them full-time. My siblings and I would go exploring, and my brother accidentally stumbled on either a moonshine or meth cabin once. He thought it was abandoned and went to check it out, but someone heard his footsteps, and suddenly he heard a bunch of people scattering around inside and someone telling everyone he'd go check to see what was outside. My brother ran back into the woods and didn't stop running. We stopped going back there after that. Before that incident, we'd find makeshift tents made out of branches that hadn't been there before. Around the tents would be weird extinguished campfires and weird crap hung in the trees, like a string full of cans and bottles just hanging around like wind chimes. Even twig wreaths and figures looked like something straight out of the Blair Witch Project. All the other people in the area knew of this and said nothing. You keep your mouth shut about anything you've seen or heard in the woods because you never know who knows, or is, someone who does something secret out in the mountains. If you did happen to see something, no, that was just an animal, or even a cryptid of some sort. It wasn't a person. This story takes place during the summer when I was 15. This is a very true story about a small encounter I had. I was living with my dad and stepmother at the time, and I remember my stepmother throwing a royal fit about buying me new school clothes because I had let a few pairs of pants get holes in them and still wore them. It was my first year going to high school, and I wasn't going to let her spoil that for me, so I went to stay with my grandparents for the summer to earn some money. They live in a remote, small area that was once home to many native tribes, most prominently the Quinault tribe. It's very secluded despite being only a mile or so from the highway, and it's all lush, gorgeous forest. My grandpa had built his own 3-story house and a shop where he cut and assembled cedar into roofing products. That's where I came in, hauling heavy chunks of cedar to his van, stacking, nailing, and cinching up shake and shingle into bundles to be sold. I made good money while there and was able to buy an entire new wardrobe. As summer was coming to an end and it was too hot to work, I decided to take a walk one day. Now, let me say that I spent my childhood roaming these woods. Armed with my grandparents' 2 dogs, we ran, played, and napped all day, and I had never seen anything out of the ordinary or gotten any weird vibes. I waited until it was a bit cooler in the evening and started out, walking a little path that would take me out to an old, unused logging road. I had tread this same path so many times that I wasn't even paying attention until I felt I was being watched. I would like to note here that I was young at the time, I had yet to touch drugs or alcohol, and I have no history of hallucinations or mental illness along those lines. What I saw still haunts me to this day. There he was, standing naked in the middle of my path, looking down at me with a blank expression. He was tall, maybe 7 feet, much taller than my 5 nothing. He had long, matted black and gray hair, and there were tufts of it growing from the sides of his arms and legs as well. There were no genitals, only smooth flesh where they should be. And his skin, which was such a sickly pale yellow, looked too big for his stature and hung in some spots. We made eye contact, and his yellow orbs felt like they were staring into my soul. I couldn't move or think, everything had gone silent around me. The next 10 or so seconds of my life seemed to stretch out. We just stood looking at one another before he swiftly turned and walked back into the trees. The foliage went undisturbed as he melted through it and disappeared. I honestly expected him to charge me or at least be intimidating, but he just turned and left. I haven't seen him since either, nor am I too enthusiastic to go out looking. I've tried looking into Native American folklore, especially the local stuff, but I haven't found anything matching that description. If you have any ideas about what this particular being might be, please let me know. So when I was in high school, we lived in the woods of East Texas. I'm talking boonies. Very creepy woods where we always heard church bells with no churches nearby. One night at 1 a.m., I got up to make a snack. Across from me was a window. We lived in a trailer home on a hill. You'd have to be at least 8 feet tall to even look out this window into the house. All of a sudden, I got these chills across my body and looked up at the window. I saw a non-human creature staring at me. Bald, skinny, white, with black sunken eyes. I thought my brain was playing tricks on me, so I moved from side to side, thinking it was my reflection. The creature didn't move. I dropped whatever I had in my hand, and when I did, the creature turned its head, and I saw it run off. I could hear the leaves crunching as they ran. Walls were very thin. I screamed for my parents and made sure all the doors were locked, but my parents just thought I was sleepwalking or something. Until a few years later, my dad came home in awe. He literally looked like he had seen a ghost. He described to me exactly what I had seen years prior. He said that he was driving and turned onto our road, and ahead of his headlights was a long, skinny creature that had to have been 8 feet tall running across the road. He said the creature was white with black eyes. We both got chills and felt uneasy. I still feel weird about it. So a couple weeks ago I was doing a virtual meeting with my friends and family back in Peru, and all of a sudden my uncle, who is a retired Peruvian army member, started telling us that it was time for him to come clean so if he dies, he could go in peace. Back in the late 1980s, he commanded a group of 18 soldiers that fought terrorism in the Peruvian Amazon. One day, they had to walk to another small town in the region called Pucallpa. They were heavily armed so they could repel attacks from terrorist groups that controlled these towns, along with drug cartels. He remembers that the walk started late, so they walked till the sunrise. Despite the fact that it was nighttime, the sky was clear, and a big full moon was up there too. In the middle of the walk, he asked for a team's count. Well, it turns out that they counted 19 each time they did it. He couldn't understand it, so he called all of them to gather together to do a new face-to-face count. He was petrified and surprised when they realized that there was an additional person identical to a member of his team, with the same face, same body, same clothes, and even weapons. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, so he recalled that all army members have a secret word to identify themselves, so they asked this being. And they waited for an answer, but no response was given, so they started their fire against this thing and jumped to the bushes behind them and found nothing afterwards. After they made sure they were completed, they started walking again. After some time, my uncle asked for a new count, and voila, there were again 19 members in a group of 18, and this time it copied someone else in the team. My uncle said this kept happening again and again and lasted for more or less 7 kilometers. The walk was 12 kilometers, and he believes that most of them were copied at some point. They could not believe what they experienced, yet they were more scared when they realized that it wasn't only the moon above their heads all this time but also a big rock that followed them all the time until they reached the boundaries of the next town, when it just flew away and disappeared. My uncle said they agreed not to talk about this experience with anyone else besides their group, as it was known that in those days such a story would hurt your army career. To this day, this is the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I am an ex-wildland saw crew with lots of experience in the woods. I spent the better parts of 2020 and 2021 living primarily in a tent out in the middle of nowhere for the majority of the week and saw lots of interesting and odd stuff, but none of that can really even compare. Growing up, I used to live with my folks directly in front of a green belt, which led into some pretty impressive fir and oak woods. In these woods were old logging roads from the late 1960s that would stretch for countless miles. Pretty awesome place to grow up near, and I spent countless hours exploring. When I got a bit older, I started taking my dog on evening runs out there. In late 2017, my senior year of high school, I was taking my dog on one of the logging roads that I had run and explored every inch of. When we rounded a bend, she suddenly and very abruptly stopped in her tracks and wouldn't move. She was the sweetest dog. She would have run up and tried to play with a bear if we'd let her, so this was very out of the ordinary. It was early spring, so the sun was still setting pretty early. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the shadows were definitely lengthening. I had never heard her growl the way she did. The fur on her back was standing straight up, and she was practically drooling. Mountain lions are pretty common in my area, so I was spooked, but sightings are all too few and far between. At a pretty good distance in front of me, about 8 or so feet up a decent-sized fir tree, I caught a glimpse of what looked like someone peeking their head around the tree at me. I couldn't get much detail or features, but it looked pretty human-like, just kind of a shadowed figure. Once I caught a glimpse of it, it disappeared back behind the tree pretty suddenly. I was overtaken with an all-encompassing feeling of sheer dread. Not really terror or fear. Just like a sickening, horrible feeling. Like the sensation you get when you fall into a dream and suddenly wake up. Then it showed back up, peeking from a different tree, closer to me. I immediately felt like I was going to vomit, my ears popped, and my dog practically screamed. I've never ran so fast in my entire life. I have never seen anything like that again, not even remotely close. Or really even felt that way. And if you spend enough time out in nature, you'll start noticing little things here and there. But whatever that thing was, mountain lion or not, it sure as hell didn't want me there. To make matters a bit sad, I went back there with some friends a few months ago, and it seems like the logging company that owns that whole mountain cleared a good majority of the spots out there, including where I saw that thing. Any insight at all is greatly appreciated. I was told this story over this past summer by someone I met running a campground up by Yellowstone/Tetons. A privately owned campground located in the greater Yellowstone region. Anyhow, I checked in and met the dude running the spot. He was really laid back, down to earth, and even gave me updated accommodations, glamping instead of my campsite, for free. Anyhow, we connected pretty well, and I felt comfortable around him and safe at his spot, which is important as I travel mostly solo. Well, we started chatting one morning, and he was telling me how he spent some time on the Appalachian Trail, starting in Georgia and moving up north. I don't remember how it was brought up, but he begins telling me how one day he found a cut off the trail, an old carriage road or something, and that it was pretty quiet. Not many Appalachian Trail hikers go off onto this portion, he claimed. Anyhow, he starts telling me how one day he's hiking and begins hearing branches and twigs breaking off the trail to his side. Being the only one there, he suspects animals. According to him, he sets up camp that night and begins hearing the same noises around his campsite. Well, he begins to get sketched and decides he'll rest quickly and get back on the trail. Morning comes, and he hits trail again and begins hearing the same noises. He begins telling me how he starts to get a little sketchy at this point. He seemed pretty legit, getting emotional and whatnot, not overly dramatic, but you could tell he was affected by recalling this. The dude tells me he starts picking up his pace on the trail, and the noises begin to keep pace with him. Finally, he reached a ranger station, which was closed. He says he was so freaked out that he was ready to break in when a ranger pulled up and saw him distraught. He starts explaining what is going on, and supposedly the ranger tells him he's surprised he made it that far by himself and lets him in the station. He gets inside, and the ranger shows him a storage area with around a dozen packs that he claimed to have picked up, with nobody around. Now the story gets weird, and I feel the guy is full of poop, but again, he seems pretty emotional. He claims that while in the station, he and the ranger hear something on the roof, and he starts mimicking the sounds this creature was making. Pretty much just really strange and obnoxious creature noises. He claims it was Mothman or an alien. I have no clue what this dude was recalling, or if he was full of poop. However, it sent me on a quest to see if anyone else has had a similar experience on this portion of the Appalachian Trail. That is all. Peace. I live in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, USA. A lot of people in the cities have cabins in either northern Minnesota or rural Wisconsin. Our cabin was in northern Wisconsin, in a small town called Danbury. The cabin is on Long Lake, at the very end of Long Lake Road. Along with the cabin came almost an acre of land covered in thick forest. We carved a trail through the land for ATVs and whatnot. I'm an outdoor enthusiast, have been forever. I'm 6 feet 4 inches and fit, and have been a hunter since I was like 12. I am not really scared of people, big predators. On the other hand, I'm not a big fan of bears, wolves, man-bear pigs, whatever. This brings me to the weirdness. I'm 23 now, but at the time of the incident, I was 16. Anyway, I was at the cabin with my cousin, Jay, and grandparents. It was middle summer, I think July, hot temps, and whatnot. My cousin and I were shooting at each other with airsoft guns. We had a full-on 1v1 battle going on throughout the property, including the woods, which were my stalking grounds, as I was wearing my BDU with face cover and all, head to toe in camo. Our battle ended about 100 yards northwest of the cabin in the woods. We ended the war on the main trail and were standing and talking about the events that conspired, and I was still on guard, because I always am. I suppose I could be considered a tad paranoid. Alright, so we are talking. When I noticed something moving on our 12 about 50 meters out. I got quiet and focused on dead ahead scanning. Jay was still talking, and I whispered, "Shh." He shut up, and to freak him out, I said we were being watched as a joke because I figured the movement I caught was probably a bird or something, but then I did notice something. It's dead quiet. No birds chirping. Then I started to think, this only happens when a big predator is around, so I started looking even closer, and then I saw it. On my 12th, there was a large animal. It had reddish-brown fur and almost blended in perfectly till I focused on it. It had long front limbs, arm-like, with formidable claws. It was standing kind of slouched down against a tree like it was trying to be stealthy. It was nearly as tall as me in this state, and the only reason I saw it was because of its teeth. I think it was panting because its whitish teeth were visible. Its snout appeared to be a tad elongated, and I couldn't get a better look because my first thought was we have to go. I said it out loud, and Jay was already freaked. When I said that, he bolted up the trail towards the cabin, and he nearly left me in the dust because I was protective of him. I waited a good 3 seconds and kept my eye on it until I saw it move, and it was fast. Then I ran like hell. I didn't see which way it ran, all I know is that I heard it crash through the woods. Jay stopped at the shed to wait for me, which was still 50 meters from the cabin. When I caught up, I yelled go go go. And we both bolted to the cabin and got inside and shut the door. Then my grandma asked why we looked panicked and slammed the door. I knew they wouldn't believe me, so I said we saw a bear, and Jay nodded. Later that night, after the grandparents went to sleep, we talked about it, and I asked Jay if he saw it. He told me that he paused for a second to look back after he ran to see if I was running with him, and he saw me still looking at it. Then he saw it move too, and I ran, but mostly he said he only saw a flash of fur. He then said that I thought it wasn't the right color for a bear. I told him it wasn't. We only have black bears in the area, and the animal wasn't built right. I said I didn't think it was a bear. We have kept it between us until now. Still, the animal didn't match any known regional animal profiles in the area. I'm at a loss for what it may have been. I know that it was stalking us, though, and that it was built like an athletic predator, not like a bear, not as heavy. After the incident, neither of us would go into the woods on foot alone without a gun. We generally only went back into the woods on ATVs from that point forward. I always loved the cabin up until then. Fortunately, the cabin has been sold now. I lived up in the woods near Humboldt County, called Montgomery Creek, in North California, for about 6 years. Homesteading. I was looking out from my porch towards the mountains, looking high above the trees. I saw a white bat-like creature that was furry like a bear. It was completely white, and its bat-like wingspan was insanely large. My first reaction was, what the heck is that thing? It looked prehistoric. It did not belong there. It was all by itself, and it looked as labored as it was flying. Heavy, and it was the size of a German Shepherd from about 100 to 200 feet away. Maybe some albino bat is migrating? Do they do that? I don't know, but it was huge, and I just have no idea what it could have been. I looked up white bats, and nothing fits the bill. Any help would be appreciated. My dad and I were hunting in the mountains north of Idaho City. It was about twilight, and we were hiking back to the car. We began to smell something terrible. Like burning bones and hair. It was the worst stench I've ever experienced. The smell got worse as we kept hiking. We could hear what we thought was someone or something running at a great rate of speed from behind us. My dad grabbed me, held my face to his chest, and dropped me to the ground. I held on close to him as the running got louder. Dad readied his rifle. I heard him say, "Oh no. Son, stand up. Walk with me. Look at the ground." Terrified, I stood. Stupid me turned around and looked. There were the remains of an elk. The head looked like it had been put in a blast furnace. The hair on the body was all singed. The hooves looked melted. The running was gone. We moved closer to the car. It was now nearly dark. About 100 yards from the car, we heard the car running again, and we froze. All of a sudden, the forest lit up like noon. We heard a very loud whoosh, and it was gone. The forest was dark. It was quiet. Dead still. We booked it for the car. We threw our gear in the back seat and drove. I kept my head down and just cried. Dad was stoic and silent. Halfway out of the woods, we saw the light again. Bright as ever. But just for a second. And then it was gone again. I made it back to Idaho City and stopped at the Gold Mine Grill to regroup. I went inside, and there was another hunter in there. He looked at us and said, "Y'all see that SHT?" He just stared and drank. I was sitting against a tree on public land. There was an old logging trail behind me with a really thick pine plantation on the other side of that. The logging trail came from my right to my left, then turned away from me and wrapped around the edge of the pines. Anything that followed the path around that turn disappeared from sight. As I am hunting, I hear the rhythmic clip-clop of a horse behind me and to the right. I turn to look, and I see a rider on a chestnut horse coming up the logging trail. I was a bit annoyed that he was interrupting my hunt, so I gave a low whistle and waved to let him know I was there. He didn't flinch, he just kept on riding. The weird part is that he didn't have a normal expression. His face was blank, almost featureless. He seemed to just stare straight ahead. It was the definition of a 1,000-yard stare. There was something else off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on what. He kept on down the trail, turned, and looped around where the trail curled behind the pines. I lost sight of him with how thick they were, but I could still hear the clip-clop of the hooves on the ground. I was annoyed that he didn't acknowledge me when I waved, so I walked after him to ask why he ruined my hunt. As I turned behind the pines where he disappeared and looked down the trail, there was nothing. He had just gone down that path. There was no way he could have gotten all the way down the trail and out of sight in the time it took me to get there, so I looked down to see where his tracks went. But there were no tracks. At 170 pounds, I was making clear footprints in the mud, yet an 800-pound horse left nothing? I was really freaked out, and it was about dusk anyway, so I started for my truck. I took a shortcut through a small patch of wood that I hadn't explored yet. It was directly in the direction from which the rider had come. As I crossed a ridge, I saw the remnants of a chimney and the foundation of a house. This wasn't too odd, since the land was reclaimed farmland, so I took a second to look around. In what would have been the backyard, there was an old family cemetery. I couldn't make out any names or dates, but the land I was hunting was sold to the state around 1900, which means any private burial sites would have been from the 1800s or earlier. That's when it hit me what was so off about the rider. On top of his 1,000-yard stare, unresponsiveness, and ability to seemingly disappear, his clothing was all off. He was wearing a nondescript blue wool coat and trousers. I didn't immediately identify it as a Civil War uniform, but in retrospect, it kind of looked a lot like one. When that hit me, I booked. It's hard to explain, but I felt like I was suddenly being watched from all directions at once. I know it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I bolted anyway. I full-on ran for the truck, got in, and sped away. That was 11 years ago, and I haven't been back to that woodlot since. Who knows, though? Maybe I saw a recreational rider with a taste for old-school clothes or a Civil War reenactor. I'm sure there is a logical explanation. But at the time, it chilled my blood and sent me running for the truck. I was staunchly against the existence of ghosts before that day, but now I'm not so convinced. This happened in 2016, so I was around 21 or 22 when a friend was driving me home from her house. The road we normally take, a back road but very busy with traffic, was closed for construction, so we took the detour road. We have the windows down because we finished a blunt about 15 minutes prior. This was a 30-minute ride back to my house. Halfway through the detour road, we both get this sense of absolute evil dread, and we then both notice that there is no sound. No nature sounds, frogs croaking, breeze through the trees, wind from the car. The radio was on and not playing music, no matter how we ducked with the channel or the volume. It was like we were in an air pocket with absolutely no sound whatsoever. You could barely see outside, but we at least could make out trees and shit with the headlights. Nope. It looked like we were in a completely dark tunnel. Lasted about 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden the noise came back on with this sudden pop. Frogs, trees, the sound of the car, the radio, all of it. We kind of just sat still and said nothing, and as soon as we saw a gas station, she pulled over, and we smoked a cigarette, and we were both kind of like, ha, what just happened? Everything was 100% normal after that, and it never happened again. I've been on that road hundreds of times since, but it was genuinely strange, and it scared the shit out of both of us. I went to Hocking Hills and camped there for a week, and I just got home this past Tuesday. We were tent camping at one of the riverfront rustic sites, and there were only a few people in the campground besides us. My friends and I just got done playing beer bong, and it was around 3:45 a.m. Everyone started heading to bed but me and my one friend. I had said I was going to go on a drive through the back roads and had asked if she wanted to join. She said no. So I went alone and ended up driving through the Clear Creek Metro Park roads. I had a lot of fun jamming to music and charging my phone at the same time since we didn't have power. I drove by something called Witch's Rock, which is a giant boulder that hangs over the road. It was pretty cool. As I got further in, I made a couple of turns and ended up on a single car road with no turnaround areas. I didn't have service and was planning on driving for a bit longer till I got reception and mapped my way home. By now, it was probably like 5 a.m., and I was coming up to a stop sign where there was no left turn, only right, but there was a gate straight ahead with cows, like maybe 15 feet behind it. I was sitting there trying to change the music on my playlist when I looked up at the gate and watched as something grayish and dark walked straight past these cows, then disappeared into the darkness. I'm not scared easily. By no means. But my heart clenched so bad I couldn't breathe, and I went. Still, there was nowhere to turn around, so I just gassed it to the right instead of turning around and finally hit service a bit down the road, sing my way back to my campsite, which was about 40 minutes. But the whole way down that road and even onto the next road, GPS took me on what was called the Revenge Road until I turned off that street. I felt a sense of being followed, as well as pure dread and fear. Once I turned off that road, my whole body melted, and I felt calm again. Whatever had stopped following me around then, I believe, because it felt like nothing even happened after that. I still don't know what it was, but even explaining it to my friends is a long shot of how I felt. I got back to the site around 5:45 a.m. and stayed in my car till sunrise. Then I finally went inside my tent to go to bed. The happiest thing I've had happen to me so far while camping. I loved Hocking Hills, though. It was amazing and beautiful out there, but at night and alone, it's really creepy, and eerie, and I for sure saw something out there. I was probably 13 or 14 and was fishing with my buddy and his dad on the Salmon River in Idaho. We get to a remote spot on the river in an old Jeep Wagoneer. It was late in the day. The banks of the river weren't wooded, it was more of a heavy brush. We were spread out a little bit, each doing our own thing. I was downriver about 25 or 30 yards from my friend, he was about the same distance downriver from his dad. I remember having a weird feeling, much like the op described, as if I were being watched. At first, there wasn't anything to go with the feeling other than just kind of an eerie atmosphere. Later, I heard some rustling in the brush, but decided not to get freaked out and kept fishing. Maybe 5 minutes after the rustling, I heard a big splash in the river. It wasn't like a fish jumping, it was something huge, like a big rock, being thrown in. Now I was freaking out. I trudged my way back up to my friend as fast as I could. He described having the same weird feeling earlier. We both decided to go up to his dad. When we got to his dad, I told him what happened. He didn't seem surprised. He told us that when we first split up, he heard some small splashes behind him, but he figured it was us messing with him. So, we jumped back in the old Wagoneer and got the hell out of there. Whoever or whatever it was didn't want us there, and since they didn't want us there, we didn't want to be there either. It sounds ridiculous, but my brother and I were coming back from a long route that we often hunt or scout at various times of the year. Back in the old Garmin GPS 2 days. There is more to do about getting out for a good day hike and setting better waypoints. Sunset was about an hour away, and there is this lake I like to stop at since I always pack an ultralight to get a few casts in. Have a few shots of whiskey on occasion. I've been there many times. I knew where we were but couldn't get satellites for shit. Zero wind, dead calm, thick fog. Zero sky. The whole day was hazy, but this was the next level. The fog that rolled in was like nothing I've seen but a few times in my life, and the bulk of it was but a few feet off the ground and water, the real thick of it. It was quite the sight, and we discussed not staying long since the visibility was getting to around 10 feet or less, and we had a good 2 miles back to where the vehicle was stashed. A small part of the trip back would be a quarter mile of some old railroad tracks between the trailheads. Soon after a few casts, the most crazy sound we've both ever heard started coming in from around 50 yards off the water. I thought I'd heard everything, and I'm super familiar with southern Wisconsin all the way to the Canadian border as far as game and Midwest wildlife are concerned. This loud gargling and coughing out in the water was quite interesting. We had a good laugh and had a conversation about it. This was a marshy lake with some swampy areas surrounding it. I had assumed that it was possibly a snapping turtle, an injured deer, or even a bear. Every now and then a large splash, then a few hard steps through the water like it was chasing something, a coughing hiss, and then some gurgling. There are no moose in this region. We joked more along the lines of swamp monsters. We were laughing pretty good about it, but within 10 minutes, whatever this was, it's getting really close. At first, some gargling and groaning was straight out in front of us, then we soon shifted to the shoreline again. I couldn't see SHT in any direction. We both looked at each other as I started breaking down my rod and reel, and my brother unsnapped the holster on his .44. We laughed as I threw on my pack and said, "I'm not even going to wait to see whatever that is." It just freaked us out. You had to hear it. It was like someone walking the shoreline while gargling water quite loudly and spitting it out. And mind you, I grew up fishing here and never heard anything like it. Sometimes it seemed in front of us, in deeper water, which is why I thought of snapping turtles. We got moving. Walking some deer paths for about 50 yards gets you on the railroad tracks, and the rest of the walk is not usually too bad, but the fog kept me second guessing everything. Well, west was the tracks, just blaze the least path of resistance to the tracks. Done. And people ask why we carry GPS and a compass to this day. So we stopped on the tracks and had to reorganize the gear that we hastily threw together on the lake and started to strap down and organize everything for a tight fit and fast movement back since it was getting dark on top of the fog problem. Flashlights were going to be almost useless. Just as we were ready to move, something hit the rocks on the railroad, maybe 30 yards or so behind us. If you've walked on railroad rocks, you know the sound. Something was kicking them. Mind you, we can't see more than 10 feet in any direction. And at this point we're on alert for more of someone human messing with us, even though it's unlikely to encounter anyone on any normal day. I already mounted my rifle to my pack, and we were in ultra quiet mode right now. What could come running out of the fog at us? I had no sidearm, so there I am again, pulling my bolt rifle out. My brother was ready with his Ruger 44. I motioned to wait in case he was deciding to shoot a round as a warning so I could cover my ears. I picked up a few rocks and threw them in the general direction. Nothing but silence. We quietly started moving on toward our next trailhead, staying on the wood planks as much as possible, making double time. Again, rocks slide off the tracks behind us. I set down my rifle, cupped my ears, and looked at my brother. Boom. He fires a round in the air. Nothing but silence followed. We double timed back the rest of the way, occasionally stopping to listen behind us and getting lost a few times since fog really messes with your memory and sense of direction. We still joke about it to this day. What the hell was that? It's easy to get spooked, and I've had other strange things happen, but probably nothing but paranoia or coincidence most of the time. The times when you feel like you're being watched or followed. This happened in Grindstone, Pennsylvania, back in the 90s. I was probably about 8 years old, and my brother was about 5 years old. We lived on a couple acres in the country, with a farm on one side and your basic farm fencing with a thick forest on the other side. Growing up in the sticks and dad being an avid hunter, we kids were taught to be aware of our surroundings and wild animals, things like that. Anyway, as a kid, I thought the woods were creepy or scary. There was no reason in hell I would have gone into them by myself. So, I was playing outside with my little brother, and he went into the house. There I was by myself, and I heard my mom calling for me, "Kimberly, come here, Kimberly over here, come on, Kimmy." This was a little weird to me because why would my mom be in the woods right now? I climbed over the fence anyway and started walking towards my mom's voice. Then, out of the blue, I felt like I was being watched and got a bad feeling. I started to wonder how mom got into the woods without going past me, thoughts like that. So, I turned and quickly ran back to the house, where I found mom at the kitchen table and my brother playing video games in the living room. I then asked her if she called for me, and she said no, so I told her what happened, which led to us kids being told to stay inside and play for the rest of the day. I'm now in my early 30s, and I've asked my mom about this incident, and she still swears she never called for me. There is something about this situation that really bothers me to this day. It was about 5 a.m. on a cold November morning. I was going over to a buddy house that had about 40 acres where we hunted deer, rabbits, and turkeys and would have war games with paintball guns and airsoft guns in the summertime with about 6 to 10 of our other friends. We all knew the woods behind his house very well and were not scared to go back there, even if we didn't have a gun. This particular morning, it was about 15 to 20 degrees, it had dropped from 70 degrees the previous day, and the ground was frozen with the dew that had formed. I'm carrying a small flashlight, a Gatorade, a pack of beef jerky, and my .270 rifle with 6 bullets. When I pull in, my buddy meets me at his door, and we walk into the woods. It was very quiet, almost spookily quiet, but that's oddly the most pure nature you can find, so it didn't bother me too much, and seeing as I have a gun, I feel practically unstoppable. The way his woods are set up, there's one main trail you can follow, and it will go all the way to the back of the property, and there are smaller trails that break off and go around tree patches but eventually come right back to the main trail. I have a blind sitting in a wooded area at the very back of the property, and at the time I wasn't very limber, so I never climb trees, so I was going to my spot on the ground. It's about a good 1/4-1/3 mile to this particular spot from the entrance of the woods, but we generally see deer back there, so I don't mind the rather uphill hike. So we cross the creek and get almost to the small field in between the trees, and my buddy changes his mind about where he wants to sit, so he decides to climb the tree stand overlooking the creek and ridge line that is just beside the trail. I stand on the trail, watching to make sure he gets up the stand before I head on to my spot. As I start up the field less than 50 yards from him, I get the most unsettling feeling that I'm being watched. My buddy cannot see me from where he is, if that's what you're thinking. I get about 75 yards from my blind, and the woods are quiet and super dark as there is no moon shining at this time. My blind is a straight shot up this trail, and I'm standing at the entrance to this patch, and my small light is illuminating all the limbs and trees in weird and funky shapes. I still have that unsettling feeling of being watched, so I just press on and think that I'm over-imagining things. I get 30 yards up this dark trail, and I hear an echo of my steps directly behind me. I stop. It stops. I walk 3 steps. I heard it again and stopped, and it stopped in sync with me. So I think it's just me who walked like 10 more steps and decided to stop, and this time I heard 3 more steps. I instantly take the gun off my shoulder, hold it off my hip, and turn around, and nothing is there that I can see. I turn back around, and I can see my blind, so I quickly get to it, unzip it, throw my bag in, get in, and zip it closed. Here's where it gets weird. There's a chair in the blind, so I sit down, gun in my lap, finger on the safety, and trigger, just waiting for whatever it is to either come by the blind or keep moving past. About 2 minutes go by, and I'm completely wide-eyed, and my senses are on high alert. I am listening for anything and everything, but I am not hearing anything. It was seriously spooky quiet, and I loved or hated it. By now, I have barely opened the zippered windows on the sides to look out of. I have them just so I can pop an eye out to look before the sun comes up. It's about 5:30ish now, and I hear walking and running, so I know there's 2 of whatever, just literal feet from the blind. They stop with thuds, and I grip the gun, ready for whatever is about to happen. I hear chatter, but not just any kind of chatter. It almost sounded like 2 chimps chattering back and forth, and I am freaking out at this moment. I have never heard anything like this, and even being in the woods for most of my life, this was a first and hopefully last. I hear them continue past the blind and get to a fence, and I hear grunts, and I know whatever they are, they just crossed the fence. Not even 5 seconds after I knew they crossed the fence, about 30 plus coyotes went absolutely insane in this field, and now I am shaking from pure fear. I don't know what's going on, and I wish I'd just slept in. At this time, I feel my phone vibrate. Even with these coyotes still going crazy, I didn't want to check it, so I left it and still sat and waited for whatever was about to happen. The coyotes moved down the cow pasture, and the woods returned to this abnormally quiet place. When I check my phone, it's my buddy texting me 8 times. The first was, "Dude, there was something following you that I heard. You see it?" Next one, "There's 2 things following you. They looked like big dogs." Next one, "Hello? I guess you're okay. Good luck. I hope you see something." After the coyotes start hollering, "Dude, what is going on?" I reply back, "I need a new pair of underwear." After 6 a.m., there was nothing out of the ordinary. The woods woke up with all of the wildlife waking up for the day, the birds started chirping and the squirrels were chasing each other. It was rather enjoyable to watch and get my mind off of earlier that morning. After about 10:15 or so, my buddy walked the trail to me to see where all the ruckus was. He told me everything that he had seen, and I told him what happened. What we figured out was that the 2 things stalking me were coyotes. Why? I'm not sure, but they did. We guessed the 2 just happened to be coming up behind me as I made my way up the trail. We figured they would be the scouters for the rest of them in the field. To this day, I haven't been back there. I've had a few things. The first one was on the less visited west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. I was hiking back a few miles to fly fish a meadow with a creek cutting through it. It was a nice, warm, blue sky summer day. The last 1/4 mile or so of hiking before I got to the meadow, I just had this weird feeling come over me like I was being watched or followed, and I couldn't shake it. I rigged up my rod and went out into the meadow. I ended up catching a couple fish, but even when I was out in the open, I just couldn't shake this feeling. I hightailed it out of there, and the feeling left about a 1/4 mile trail. It doesn't sound like much, but it's probably the most unnerved I've ever been in the woods. Camping along the Colorado River in central Colorado, I had a buddy swear something threw a rock at him. He was down by the river washing dishes after dinner, and when I came down to help after putting the stove away, I found him on edge, holding a big chef knife, and asking me if I heard anything. He said a rock landed in the water a couple feet away from him, and he heard what could only be described as hyena-type laughter coming from the steep river bank directly downstream. We lit up the river bank with our headlamps, but whatever it was gone. Another time I was at the Penny Natural Hot Springs outside Carbondale, Colorado, at night with a friend. We parked, and after I had turned off my vehicle, removed the key, and taken a couple steps outside, my vehicle started back up on its own. Me and my friend just looked at each other like WTF, so I stuck my key back in, turned it on, then turned it off again. I removed the key, started to head down to the springs, and it happened again. I had just bought it 4 months prior and had a full inspection done, no issues were found, and it hasn't done it since. It was just bizarre, there was some weird energy there that night. My brother is 2 years older, and we've probably spent 10,000 hours and then some in the woods together. We've had our fair share of adventures and stories to tell of all sorts, but this one has felt like a lingering stain on my memory. We were both mid-20s-ish, and it was 2019, and this was probably my 5th time hunting the area and the first time I brought my brother along. It's a large forest area of public land that has a few county roads, which are basically 2 tracks that stretch miles throughout the area. We make the trip up in my truck with our tents. 3 in total. 1 for each of us, and another to change in and keep our gear in. Without making this long, we set up camp a couple miles from the truck, which we drove for quite a few miles through the trails. Basically, in the middle of nowhere, the nearest main road is probably 8 to 10 miles away. We arrived late in the night, set up camp, and quickly fell asleep after a long trip. We then spent the next day scouting and tracking, then made our way back to camp for the night. We cooked, then ate, had some beers, and bullshitted. The night was still early, but we had a long day and decided to head off for the night. Everything up until this point was normal. I was suddenly awoken to something smacking my tent and hearing my brother's voice call my name. I knew something was off. I called back to him, and he immediately unzipped my tent and made his way inside. I could tell he was disturbed when I went to ask him what was wrong, and he immediately grabbed my shoulder and told me to shush. The sun wasn't up yet, so I think it was around 4:30 or 5 a.m. we sat in my tent, and what we heard still confuses me to this day. I can only explain it as whale sounds. There were different tones of extremely loud noise that I could feel throughout my body. It would come and go, but there would only be a few seconds of silence in between the sounds. It would vary from high-pitched squeals and everything in between to very low sounds that had literal ground-shaking reverb. I regrettably didn't think to grab my phone or record anything that was going on because what I was hearing didn't seem real, and in the moment I was awestruck. The sound went on until daylight started to break. I believe it was about an hour, but I'm not really sure. Neither of us spoke, and at the time, it felt like I could feel the energy around me, almost like my body was covered in white noise, if that makes any sense. It wasn't even minutes after the sound stopped that it started to rain, and one of the craziest thunderstorms while I was camping happened. The forecast didn't predict or account for any rain on the days we were going to be there prior to making the trip. All the stakes for the tent our gear was in were completely ripped out of the ground, and both of our tents had multiple stakes ripped out as well. Those things were driven into the ground with an axe, and it would take some insane force to unearth even a single one. My brother dismisses it and won't even talk about it, saying it was just machinery being dragged, but at the time we both shared the same feeling of fear and dread. It just seems odd that it was still the middle of the night and we were so far removed from any nearby communities or industries to hear and experience this occurrence. Here in Australia, we've got a cryptid known as the Blue Mountains panther. There have been many sightings and photos of it in the past century in the Blue Mountains region, and it's been blamed on livestock and dog deaths, etc. Some people believe there's a breeding population out in the bush descended from escaped or released circus animals. Anyway, growing up, I lived on a 5-acre property that backed onto a national park. Behind our back fence, there was literally nothing but bushland, with the Blue Mountains on the other side. One night I was out in the backyard with a torch, and my dog started whimpering, acting really scared, and frantically trying to get inside the house. This was a big border collie who loved chasing kangaroos through the bush and was an excellent guard dog, so this was very out of character behavior. I shined my torch along the back fence line, and there, staring back at me, were 2 huge green feline eyes. You know the way cats' eyes look at night in a torchlight? But this was no cat. You could tell by the size and distance apart of the eyes that it was something much bigger. Also, the height had to have been large dog height, and there was nothing near that fence that anything could have been sitting on. For a few moments, the eyes just stared at me, and then it slowly started walking along the fence line in that slow, deliberate way that a cat moves when it's stalking something, all the while the eyes were still looking at me. As you could imagine, I got the hell back inside in a hurry and let the dog in too. A few days later, I heard that a man down the road woke one morning to find one of his sheep had been killed, torn to pieces. He thought it must have been dogs, but I suspected differently. Okay, this is something I experienced a few years ago. During the summer break, my sister and I were visiting our aunt, who lived in the country. Her house is located in a fairly wooded area, but there are several neighbors around. There's a man-made lake about a mile away from my aunt's place, and it is pretty much surrounded by woods. Me and my sister loved to walk around near the lake whenever we visited our aunt, ever since we were small kids, so this time too, we decided to go for a walk. It was about 5 p.m., and the sun was shining brightly. We were told not to walk alone near the lake because there could be wild animals, poachers, and whatnot, but we decided that we were old enough to go alone, 15 and 13 years old. So we sneaked out while the adults were chatting in the living room and strolled along the path to the lake. The air is fresh, the sun is bright, and we're feeling like we could take over the world. We were walking along the wooded path to the lake when my phone rang. It was my mom who was at the aunt's. Because we sneaked out without telling them and we were almost at the lake, I didn't answer it and put the phone into silent mode. Stupid, yeah, I know. Then we reach the lake, take our shoes and socks off, and dip our feet in the cool water. We talked for some time about regular teen stuff. I was telling a joke to my sister when this horrible feeling washed over me. It was like I was being watched. I instantly whipped my head around because I thought there was a perv or someone stalking us, but there was no one around. My sister, too, seemed to be spooked by something. She asked me, "Did you feel that?" And I said yes. We sat there for a few minutes, holding each other's hands and hearts in our throats, but nothing happened. The feeling eventually went away, so we brushed it off. After some time, we got bored and decided to search for something to eat. The woods around the lake were practically full of wild berries, so we decided to go pick some. I found a nice patch of berries not far from the tree line, and we quickly started picking them up and shoveling them into our mouths. I had finished half of the berries I had picked when I noticed a really cool bug on a leaf. I wanted to snap a photo of it because I hadn't seen it anywhere else. I searched my pockets for the phone, and it wasn't there. My sister asked what was wrong, and soon we both started crawling around searching for the phone. It was a fairly new one and quite expensive, so I absolutely did not want to lose it. "Don't freak out, sis," my sister, Em, said. "Let's just give it a ring. If it's nearby, we'd hear it." She took her phone out and called my number. Instantly, my ringing tone starts going off, to the left of us. It was near the path we took into the forest and was pretty loud. So I take a step to go and retrieve it, but Em grabs me by the wrist and stops me. "You turned the silent mode on, didn't you?" she asks with a shaking voice. That's when it dawned on me. I was 100% sure I turned it on. If the phone is silent, then what the duck is making the ringing tone? Then we realize that the entire forest is silent other than my ringing tone. Dead ducking silent. Em's grip on my wrist tightens. We look at each other with sheer terror in our eyes. Suddenly, the ringing stops. Silence. We waited for another 10 seconds. That's when we heard it. My aunt called out to us from somewhere deep in the woods. "M. T. I'm here." We froze. It sounded like our aunt's, but my gut told me that it wasn't. Something was off about it, like the usual emotions were absent. It was almost mechanical. Like someone mimicking something he had heard before. Then the voice called out again. This time, it was definitely wrong. It was closer to an animal trying to speak. I screamed at Em. "Run." So we ran. We ran like all hell was lost and ducking demons were driving us out of the woods. During the time we ran, I could hear something following us, hot on our heels. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, and occasional screeching noises. It was almost like a wild cat, but far more sinister. It reeked of evil. We ran past the lake as fast as we could and finally reached the paved road, where several vehicles were parked. The woods also ended there. We were out of breath and scared to the core. I turned around to look, there was nothing. Several people gave us concerned looks, but no one asked anything. We walked with a group of people who were heading in the direction we needed to go. We kept looking around, but the usual sounds were there, like birds singing. When we got home, we were immediately grounded. We were not allowed to go for walks for the rest of the time we stayed there, even with an adult. We didn't protest. Sometime later, I described this encounter to my aunt. She looked at me, her face as white as a sheet of paper, but she didn't say anything. I tried to press her for information, but every time she shook her head, she refused to talk about it. Later, I heard their town had a lot of disappearances after our experience, especially kids and homeless people. I don't know if these things are related, but something tells me they are. Both my sister and I get shivers when we talk about it, considering how close we were to getting abducted or even killed. I now know about crawlers and rakes, and I believe that's where we met. Alright, usually when I tell this story to people, they don't believe me. To be honest, I'm not even sure how it happened, but here goes. I was out running with one of my friends earlier on a popular trail in my town a few years ago, and before we began, she had stopped to tie her shoelaces. She said she would catch up with me, so I went ahead and started running. I remember I ran across the bridge that arched over a brook, spent a few more seconds going into the forest, took a turn, and all of a sudden the ground was gone. I realized I had accidentally run over an edge I hadn't seen that was partially covered by some big flowers and ferns, and I was falling towards the brook, which, by the way, was filled with all kinds of rocks that I would rather not have fallen onto. Anyways, I was internally freaking out while falling for those few seconds, but when I was about to hit the ground, I heard this weird sound that I can't describe. It was kind of like voices in my head speaking really fast or something, and all of a sudden I was back where I started, but I was in front of my friend, who at the time was still fixing her laces. She looked up and saw me and shouted so loudly, and to this day she still doesn't understand what happened either, because she swore she saw me run behind over the bridge and deeper into the woods, and it had only been a few seconds that she had looked back at her shoes. There were people there too, with the trail being popular in my town and all. The only weird thing I saw was a kid with his mother who kept staring at me like I appeared from nowhere, probably did, emo, but as far as I could see that day, no one else noticed. The whole encounter was honestly scary, and we don't really talk about it anymore because we can't explain it. I don't know what, why, or how it even happened. I love to hike in the deep woods. The fewer people, the better. I've done it many places, but Shenandoah is one of my favorites. I was doing an 8-mile hike deep in the woods on a little used trail because it was a difficult level trail. I spent the entire day hiking, had a small lunch, and only talked to 3 people the entire day. On my way back to the Big Meadows Lodge, I started to hear the scariest thing I've ever heard. Small children started to giggle. I was about 5 or 6 miles from the road, and there are no other trails in the area that could have crossed this. Still, I figured it was a trick of the woods and sounds. I walked more, and the giggling followed me through the woods. I never saw anyone or anything and thought I could identify 2 or 3 voices giggling. Soon afterwards, I started to hear the creak and the slam of an old screen door. I recognized this sound because my father had a cabin in Michigan that had a door that sounded just like this. This went on for about 2 miles, then it simply stopped. I've not shared this before because I figured most people would think I'm lying or crazy. My wife doesn't even know because she would make sure I never set foot in the woods again. So I'm a female. I'm 31 years old now, and this happened in 2006, so at the time I was 17 going on 18. My boyfriend, whom we will call M, my friend, whom we will call A, and her boyfriend, now husband, whom we will call N, are the ones involved in this unexplained event. So there is this abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods, and you can only get to it by walking about a mile one way. There are abandoned cars, an ambulance, some tractors, and other random vehicles like a short school bus, and they're all covered in gunshots. There is not even a path to drive a vehicle back there. If there were, we would be walking a mile one way to get there, so we're not sure how they even got there or how long they've been there. My boyfriend and I had gone with 2 other friends prior to our encounter, and it was creepy, but not compared to what happened when we went with A and N. So on our previous trip, we went with our friends T and J. T and I went upstairs and had a Ouija board. We just asked random stupid questions I can't even remember. What I do remember is it spelled out Hui. We said goodbye on the board and were looking around the upstairs, which was really just an attic. We found massive kids' socks on the wall. It was really random and weird. We got startled when an alarm clock started ticking. It wouldn't stop, so I smashed it to pieces, and that was that. We walked downstairs, where the boys were, and made our way back outside. We found a creepy well that was covered up, and then all of a sudden we heard that alarm clock start ticking again, but I knew I had broken it, so that kind of spooked us, but nothing major. We saw an outdoor cellar we went into, and there was a boot with a bone inside the shoe, so I was like, okay, we're done for today. Let's go. So my boyfriend and I were telling A and N about this cabin and what happened when T and J came with us. So we decided we were going to go later that day. So the day this encounter happened, M, N, A, and myself went to the lake, packed a cooler with food and crap, and spent probably 5 hours or so at the lake, ate, and just hung out. We left the lake, stopped at A and N's house, and dropped the cooler off, which was in the trunk of the car. This is important for later in the story. After getting everything out of the trunk from our lake trip, We headed to my boyfriend's parents' house, where we parked the car and began our hour-long walk. We had flashlights, and that was it. The walk there was very uneventful. We had to walk through 2 huge drainage tunnels to get to this cabin as well. So we made it there, and it wasn't dark out, but it seemed different this time. I'm not sure how to really explain it, but it was just different. But we did come later in the day than previously, so I was like, okay, whatever. Just like last time, when we got inside, A and I were going to go upstairs. I wanted to show her the socks on the wall, and I also wanted to check on that clock. On my last visit, I heard tickling outside previously. As we started to go up the stairs, there was a big crash, like something was thrown or knocked over.
I gets freaked out, and then, out of nowhere, she books it outside, back down to the creek, yelling at N and myself to come on.
I go chasing after her, and she's in tears, having a full-blown panic attack, saying something. Finally, I get that she saw someone looking in the window at us. We tell the guys, and literally nobody is around, only the 4 of us. Since she's so distraught, we decided to go ahead and leave. So as we're walking back down the creek bed, heading back the same way we came, which is the only way there, M and N are kicking over these huge rocks. We stop and realize there are huge rocks, I'd say boulders, standing right up in a line the entire way down the creek bed. They couldn't have been there, not even 20 minutes prior, because we'd have noticed them as we were now. So this seriously freaked all of us out. This is not normal, and this is not natural. So we pick up the pace and start to haul us out of there. We make it to the first drainage tunnel, and we turn on our flashlights. Literally, none of them will turn on. There were 4 flashlights that worked perfectly fine on the way there, and now none of them will turn on. Holy shit. What is happening? So 30 minutes later, we're back at my boyfriend's parents' house, where A and N cars are parked. I gets in the car because, at this point, she's ready to go the duck home and forget this event ever happened. The rest of us are still outside the car. A suddenly gets out of the car, screaming, jumping up and down, and flaying around. She is covered in ants. We are like, what the actual duck is going on? So we look, and they're coming from the back seat in the trunk. N opens the trunk of his car, and laying in the trunk is this huge, rusty, extremely old wool sock covered in ants. Now remember what I said earlier in the story? We had been in and out of that trunk all day long, and there was nothing in the trunk when we left their house from dropping off the cooler. Now there is a ducking wool sock covered in ants that covers their car. This was too much for any of us to even wrap our heads around. Needless to say, we've never been back there, and I personally will never go back there. So it turns out that the man who used to live in that cabin was named Hubert, and he was often called Huey. My boyfriend had actually been to the cabin once before I ever went, and he found these journals there. The man was an alleged molester. His journals went into detail about his urges, etc. I'm not going to go into that too much. But again, this story is 100% true, and it was honestly the one and only time I've ever encountered something like this. I will never go back to that cabin. Ever. Even to this day, I have been talking about it, and right now I have goosebumps. I can't explain what happened that day. I have no idea what A saw that scared her so badly in the window. But I do know boulders do not stand straight up on their own in a line, and nobody could have done it so fast to scare us. Nobody could have messed with our 4 flashlights, and nobody could have put that old, dirty, and infested wool sock in the A and N car trunks. If you ever wander through the woods and come across a random cabin, just leave it alone. You never know who lived there, what they did, or who or what may still be there. Unfortunately, I learned that in a very hard and unsettling way. This happened to me about 11 years ago, when I was 14. Thinking about it now still brings up the same intense, eerie feeling that makes my eyes water. I grew up in the rain-soaked evergreen forests of the Olympic Peninsula, Washington. I was backpacking and hiking in those woods from the time I could walk, and I usually feel at ease on the trail alone as long as I have a faithful dog around. One wet, misty fall evening, I decided to take my dog Kayla on a bike ride with me along a dirt road near my house. Kayla was an extremely intelligent golden retriever, very friendly but fiercely protective when she needed to be. She usually stayed within 30 feet in front of me whenever we went running or biking. The dirt road was crowded by thick Douglas fir trees, whose needles were saturated with dew. It was still fairly light outside, but the trees looming overhead enshrouded much of the roadway from the sky. About 2 miles down the road, Kayla suddenly halted, her hackles raising. Planting her legs in an aggressive stance, she began to growl ferociously. At this point, I had stopped my bike and stood about 15 feet away from her. 40 feet ahead, there was an offshoot from the road, a small, overgrown set of tracks that looked like they were rarely used. Tall grass sprouted from the center. The forest had reclaimed most of it, and it was too dark to see much past the entrance. Just to the side of the road next to the entrance, there was a pile of junk pouring out of a shredded black trash bag, and what looked to be a ragged brown rug piled on top of it. It was then that I noticed the smell, a thick, rotting stench, that assaulted my senses. Sometimes people would come out into the remote woods to dump their trash. At first, I thought my dog was being stupid, growling at the rug, thinking it was an animal. But I knew she was too smart for that, and a feeling of dread crept up my spine. Something was watching us from the shadows of the overgrown road. Whatever it wasn't human, or she wouldn't be growling rabidly. If it were a small animal, she would already have it in her jaws. I called her name sharply, hoping she would move closer to me, away from the entrance. As I was looking at Kayla, I heard branches cracking and rustling in the darkness ahead. My eyes darted toward the sound. Something big moved across the tracks, entering the woods on the side closest to us and crashing through the wall of branches. I couldn't make out the full shape, but it was huge, at least as large as a bear, and covered in thick, dark fur. It almost looked as if it were running upright, but I saw so little of it that I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Adrenaline shot through my veins. "Kayla, come now!" I screamed, tears of terror filling my eyes. I whipped my bike around and pedaled furiously, fear fueling every thrust of my feet. I could hear Kayla's forepaws scattering the dirt as she galloped behind me. I didn't turn to see if it had emerged behind me. All I could think of was how glad I was to not be on foot. It felt like an eternity until I finally arrived on our safe, grassy lawn. I tossed my bike aside and slammed open the front door, startling my older brother in the kitchen. Words breathlessly tumbled out of my mouth as I tried to explain what happened, that I didn't know what I saw. He didn't believe me, insisting that it was probably just a stray dog or something and that the dim light was playing tricks on me. Or I was just making SHT up. He said he would go check it out. I pleaded with him not to go, and he must have seen the glint of genuine fear in my eyes. He said he would take the car. Though I was still shaking with adrenaline and fear, I didn't want him to go alone. We would be safe in the car, right? Just as we were heading out the door, my petite mother emerged from downstairs, asking what the ruckus was about. I'm still not sure why my mother, who locks herself in her room at the sight of a centipede, wanted to go look for some strange large animal in the woods. My brother stepped into the garage and grabbed the first weapon he could find, my dad's machete. We shut Kayla inside the house and piled into our trusty old 80s Honda. The tires crunched as they ground small rocks further into the dirt along the road. Slowly, we crept up on the abandoned path. That's where I saw it. It ran across there. We sat there for a moment, stopped about 20 feet away, and then my brother cracked open the door. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "If there was anything here, it's probably long gone now. I want to look for tracks." I told myself he was probably right, the thing had plenty of time to leave. I slowly stepped out of the car. All three of us moved cautiously toward the path, peering at the dirt. The overpowering stench I had smelled before was even stronger now, and a wave of nausea passed over me. We were only about 10 feet from the car when a low, angry growl emanated from the trees ahead. I had never heard anything like it before or since. It was a deep and powerful growl that almost sounded more like someone saying "e" at a very low, rumbling bass pitch. It lasted maybe a full 5 seconds. All of us froze simultaneously. I don't know why, but I blurted out softly, "Did you hear that?" Which seemed to jolt everyone from their trance at once. "Holy shit," I whispered to my brother. We leapt toward the car in unison, my brother slamming the door shut while cranking the stick into reverse and hitting the gas. The short drive home was silent, and there was very little said for the rest of the night. I did not venture into the woods near my house for months afterwards. My brother is now an experienced backwoods hunter and woodsman, and he still says he has no idea what produced the noise we heard. He now always brings his trusty .357 revolver with him whenever he goes near the woods, for protection from whatever aggressive creatures he may encounter in the dense forests of Washington. I'm 29 years old, and this happened about 13 to 14 years ago. Back in the day, the soldiers who had been stationed here would go out to train in the woods. We would go there almost every day, checking the shooting ranges for bullets, shells, etc., whatever we could find. Since I am half American, I would talk to many soldiers, and often we would trade beer or chocolate for some MREs. In this forest, there used to be a woman. We called it Voltexa. I guess you would translate it to forest witch in English. This woman lived in the woods for 25 years. The last thing I heard about this woman was that she got arrested by the police and is locked up in a mental asylum. We often talked to this lady, and she would talk about random stuff that made no sense at all. She often talked about Witchtale Manor. I have no clue what the English translation would be. Maybe some kind of dwarf or idiot is not too sure about it. She even showed us the clothing she sewed or knitted for them and said it was some kind of tribute so that she could live peacefully in the forest. Judging by the size of the clothing, they had to be like a foot tall. Anyway, on this particular day, me and 2 buddies decided to ride our bikes deeper into the woods just to explore and maybe find a new shooting range. In the distance, we saw a person sitting on a log beside the trail. My bud was like, "That has to be the witch." It turned out that he was right. As we got closer to her, she stood up and blocked our path. She was really angry and asked us what we were doing here. We've told her that we just wanted to explore the woods some more. This is about the time when I was a little creeped out. She started to talk weird stuff about crabbenmensken, some kind of crab humanoids. At one point, we'd had enough of her crazy stories, and we kind of laughed it off. I said to her, "Well, maybe we meet one of your friends along the way." We hopped back on our bikes, and just as I was going to pedal off, she suddenly grabbed my arm. It was a really tight grip she had on me, and with a kind of creepy smile, she said, "I warned you." I told her to duck off and let me go. We kept advancing deeper into the woods and joking about the things she said. We maybe did about, I'd say, 2 more kilometers until the trail was so bad it became impossible to ride a bike. We have taken a break and decided to turn around. All 3 of us were just sitting on an old log, and suddenly I got goosebumps, and even my eyes got a little bit watery. I look over to Daniel and notice he has goosebumps. Mark, my other friend who was with us, said, "You guys feel that way, we are being watched." Daniel is the type of guy who always goofs around and stuff, and I would have bet all my money in that moment that he would say something like the crab people are stalking us just to break the tension, but he didn't. Instead, he said with this serious tone, "We should get the duck out of here now." We were riding out of the woods at a really fast pace, and it felt like forever to get out of there. We have never really talked about it, not even after all these years. I have goosebumps writing this part of it. I was really scared that day. The silence was what freaked me out. You didn't hear a bird, a branch falling off a tree, or anything else. Just this dead silence. Who knows what is out there? This happened for about 6 months over the course of a month. With 3 visits to Cooper's at around 3 a.m. I met a guy who ended up becoming a good friend of mine, and part of what I liked about him is that he's a logical, very well planned out person. He's had some really weird experiences throughout his life, and he shared this one with me. He told me a story about how he'd gone up to Cooper's late at night to walk around, shrouded in nature. He's got unnaturally good night vision, so he didn't bring a light, and he parks his car, walks past the gate, and is on his way to the overlook, but notices there's nothing chirping or making sounds like they would at night. Past the clearing and the parking lot, he almost runs into this thing. It's big, almost glowing white in the moonlight. It growls, and he's a big dude, so he figures it's an animal of some kind and gets ready to just punt it if it attacks. It lunges at him, and he begins running backwards because the sound it's making isn't any sound he's ever heard from an animal. He's been out in the woods his entire life, on endless hunts, hikes, and camping trips. He knows these woods like the back of his hand. As he's telling me this, I'm thinking he's bullshitting me. So I asked to go up. This is the first trip with me. He wasn't really feeling up to it, but due to the fact that I asked and asked, he obliged and got out of the car first to see if it was there, in the road, or anything. I'm waiting for him, and it's feeling like forever. I took a video of him going in and back out of the car while I waited, and I soon got really anxious and tired of waiting. I felt like 20 minutes had passed. At this point, it is important to note that his car is off, but I'm hearing a woman speak and yell. I brush it off as the radio, but then realize the fake keys are in my hand. The radio is off, nobody else up here is active besides us. Beyond spooked at that point. He starts walking back to where I can see him, and I notice he's acting weird, kind of looking over his shoulder. I get ready to get out of the car, and he turns the car on. He's telling me we're not coming back unless we bring flashlights. He's seen it again. So we leave. We come back probably a couple days later and still haven't brought a flashlight. We're idiots, we know, and this time he actually lets me get out of the car with him. We're walking just like all the other times, except this time we reach the clearing, and I stop. Dread fills my body, and I'm thinking, oh man. But we get a little closer, and in what light the moon has, I see this thing. Big, white thing. Now, in past conversations, we had both concluded it was a sign the caretakers put out every day or an albino animal, so I was feeling pretty comfortable up until now. I tell him we need to turn around, not get any closer, and we leave again. In the car, we didn't feel safe until we hit the highway again. He's asking me if I finally saw it, and I said yeah, whatever it was. He thinks it's a big dog-looking thing because, when he got up close to it for the first time, It had fur. I brush it off as a welcome sign or something. There are some big signs. The third and final time we went up, it was Halloween night, and we finally got a flashlight. Cliché, I know, it's around 11 p.m. when we get up there, park the car, and do what we need to, and we actually reach past the place where we stopped the first time. Listen to the wildlife, there is no sign of this sign. We get to the overlook and spend about 40-ish minutes just talking and looking out over the landscape. We decide to head back, and we're silent. Nothing going on out of the ordinary, nothing weird. When we get back to the car, we discuss and feel really confident about the fact that if it were a sign, wouldn't it still be upright at sunset? In the same exact spot? They wouldn't just put it up at 3 a.m.? I had gone up with another friend while it was business hours, and there was no sign to be seen in that spot. So I had already concluded, in my mind, that it wasn't a sign or a decoy to scare people away. This thing growled. And it was big. Even from a distance. We've agonized over it over and over again and still can't fathom whatever it was. And we've tried every logical route there is to go down, but it just doesn't make any sense. He and I grew up in these woods, and we never felt the anxiety of being up there the way we did when we first saw it. I spent summers there just exploring, never feeling unsafe. But now I carry just an extra sense of caution every time I'm up there around sunset. Not a ghost story, but anything helps to ease my mind. If you've experienced anything, please let me know. My coworker had a strange experience yesterday morning that we're trying to figure out. This happened in Stone Mountain, Georgia. At about 5 a.m. he was taking his trash to the street before taking his daughter to school when he saw a small shape in the grass a few feet away from him. At first, he thought it was a rabbit, given the large ears he could make out in the dark. However, it began to make a sound he described as an aggressive mixture of chittering and a growl. The word he used to describe it was gremlin-like. It started to move away in a hopping motion. Whatever this thing was then leapt onto the fence to his neighbor's property and then to his neighbor's roof, in 2 bounds. He also used the word flying, but I don't think he means that literally, where it continued to make its bizarre chatter. He went back inside, not sure what to make of this. He says he wasn't really scared of it, as it was no more than knee height, but he was still alarmed. When he went back outside a minute or so later, there was no sign of it. When he described it to me, I showed him a few illustrations of the Hopkinsville goblin, and he said what he saw looked a fair deal like the illustration. Another interesting tidbit he mentioned is that he's noticed fewer and fewer animals in the neighborhood. There used to be a good amount of stray cats, rabbits, and the like, but recently he's seen no animals around. He thinks whatever he saw has been killing small animals in the neighborhood. I should mention that the cul-de-sac he lives on backs up on pretty thick woods, and like any stretch of wood in North Georgia, there's been some weird noises from time to time. He didn't really get a good look at the thing as it was pretty dark, and he barely noticed it before it bounded off, but the thing that stood out the most was its large ears. I couldn't tell if it was on 2 legs or 4. He's not the most woodsman type guy, but he knows what calls all the animals around here make, and it wasn't like anything he's ever heard. So anyway, what the hell was this thing? Bat? Bobcat? Goblin? Devil monkey? One of Santa's elves on a scouting mission? Rabbit of Kerbaneg? My girlfriend is going with a pygmy Krampus, so nothing is off the table here. One winter day, after snow had stopped falling, I decided to go for a walk in the woods. I was following an intermediate trail that bordered houses' backyards on one side and plain forest on the other when I noticed a certain set of footprints in the snow. There were several tracks, but this one stood out because it appeared to have been made by those kind of thin ballerina-like shoes, which leave the top of the foot bare. Now, there were about 1.7 inches of snow, which means that anything less than boots would have been very uncomfortable. All the other tracks were from boots. I thought that whoever made these might have been caught by the snow and had to rush home, but the spacing showed no sign of hurry, and the footprints didn't appear to have received further snow covering, which meant that whoever made these deliberately walked in thick snow with these tiny shoes and wasn't much inconvenienced by it. My curiosity was piqued. I stood there for a few minutes, pondering whether I should follow those clearly female footprints and risk passing for a stalker. Then I remembered all kinds of weird, unexplained stuff I'd seen in the past and regretted not investigating further, and I thought, to hell with it, I'm getting to the bottom of this. So, I went and followed the trail for about a mile. It led out of the woods to some wide grassy area, now blanketed with snow, where a rather isolated house was. The thing is, the trail did not lead to the door but to a nondescript spot along the backyard fence, and it just stopped there. The snow on the ground, outside, and inside the fencing was perfectly smooth. The fence was not planted directly in the ground but into a thick concrete border. I thought maybe the person had decided to climb onto the fence and kind of shimmy along for some reason, but the snow on the concrete border and even on the fence itself was undisturbed. Whoever or whatever made those footprints didn't grab the fence and shimmy across the border or anything. They just disappeared into thin air. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good way outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside of that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but it also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas being torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy, I hated it. The drive, obviously, took most of the day, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin on the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in scouts for a couple years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough. There was dust and dirt everywhere, flies, and I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit, getting the sleeping bags out, and setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was an hour, maybe. When we woke up, it was early. About 7 a.m. we decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees that was lightly dense, and we luckily found some signs of hogs. It was typical to tear up the ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there, not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing a bright colored red jacket. We slowly walked toward them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we were hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all, she was dead still. We were about 30 years away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. The weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer, it was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again, but there was no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip from his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person on their right side, and then my dad told me to stay put about 20 years away. I stayed and crouched down, watching him circle around to the left of the man, all the while talking to him and asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the left of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back, saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most: the clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than any day at most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him getting worried. Almost immediately after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panic tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was highly fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but with me being young and the lease possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. It turns out that next week he got a call from his buddy, and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone, no mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. I have no idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. So whoever was out there, I'm glad we never met. In late moose season in northern Norway, I was working the trail of a large moose cow with my dog and had been at it for about 4 hours in birch woods up near the tree line in the area I hunt in each year with my hunting party. The weather was miserable, cold, wet, and overall just plain old grim. As I and my dog closed the gap with the cow, we started to find very fresh tracks. Which is generally a good thing. As we are crossing a large stretch of semi-open ground where a snow avalanche had broken down a lot of trees the previous winter, my dog stops dead in his tracks about 100 meters in front of me. I figured out that he had spotted the moose and waited for me. As I got closer to him, I sort of prepared myself for, hopefully, a shot at the moose. This stench hits my nostrils. It smells of wet, dirty wool, carrion, and very musky sweat. The sort of which you get on hunting dogs who have worked really hard all day. I bent down to put the leash on my dog, just in case, and slid around into the chamber of my rifle, when I got this really foreboding feeling of being somewhere I don't belong. The woods were dead quiet, with the exception of the wind and the panting of my dog, who was getting a bit restless. The smell kept getting stronger and stronger, and it was so bad I almost started gagging when I heard these low guttural sounds coming from a thicket of trees about 50-ish meters to my far left. I pulled my dog along, turned back, and walked as calmly as I could while keeping a firm hold of my rifle. I radioed the rest of the hunting party and told them I had lost track and was retracing my steps for a bit, but in reality, I wanted as much ground as possible between me and whatever was giving off that smell. I have been hunting for 25 plus years and have never smelled anything like it. I have made a point to avoid the tract of land ever since. Back in the 1980s, I lived at the Line Camp on the Cook Ranch, now Cerro Pelon Ranch. One August afternoon, I went jogging from our house on the back side of Cerro Pelon, which we called the Wave, running along a ranch road northward across the wide canyon to the North Windmill. When I came to a point, about a mile from the Lie Camp, a less used trail forked off the road. I paused, let my gaze follow the faint ruts of the trail, and did a double take. There was a man standing in the middle of the old trail. He was wearing buckskins and had his hair pulled back in a knot. We looked at each other for a few minutes, and then I called out, "Hey, what are you doing here?" The man did not reply but turned, walked a few steps away from me, and stood behind a small juniper bush. He turned back and looked at me again, then began walking away from me. I kept watching until he disappeared over a rise. It creeped me out, and I didn't follow him. The next day, I ran to the same spot and then walked along the old trail. I couldn't find any footprints around the bush where I'd seen him standing or along the trail. Probably what I saw was an apparition of some sort. I ran down that road many times but never saw the apparition again. To this day, this is the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I am an ex-wildland saw crew with lots of experience in the woods. I spent the better parts of 2020 and 2021 living primarily in a tent out in the middle of nowhere for the majority of the week and saw lots of interesting and odd stuff, but none of that can really even compare. Growing up, I used to live with my folks directly in front of a green belt, which led into some pretty impressive fir and oak woods. In these woods were old logging roads from the late 1960s that would stretch for countless miles. Pretty awesome place to grow up near, and I spent countless hours exploring. When I got a bit older, I started taking my dog on evening runs out there. In late 2017, my senior year of high school, I was taking my dog on one of the logging roads that I had run and explored every inch of. When we rounded a bend, she suddenly and very abruptly stopped in her tracks and wouldn't move. She was the sweetest dog, she would have run up and tried to play with a bear if we'd let her, so this was very out of the ordinary. It was early spring, so the sun was still setting pretty early. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the shadows were definitely lengthening. I had never heard her growl the way she did. The fur on her back was standing straight up, and she was practically drooling. Mountain lions are pretty common in my area, so I was spooked, but sightings are all too few and far between. At a pretty good distance in front of me, about 8 or so feet up a decent-sized fir tree, I caught a glimpse of what looked like someone peeking their head around the tree at me. I couldn't get much detail or features, but it looked pretty human-like, just kind of a shadowed figure. Once I caught a glimpse of it, it disappeared back behind the tree pretty suddenly. I was overtaken with an all-encompassing feeling of sheer dread. Not really terror or fear. Just like a sickening, horrible feeling. Like the sensation you get when you fall into a dream and suddenly wake up. Then it showed back up, peeking from a different tree, closer to me. I immediately felt like I was going to vomit, my ears popped, and my dog practically screamed. I've never ran so fast in my entire life. I have never seen anything like that again, not even remotely close. Or really even felt that way. And if you spend enough time out in nature, you'll start noticing little things here and there. But whatever that thing was, mountain lion or not, it sure as hell didn't want me there. To make matters a bit sad, I went back there with some friends a few months ago, and it seems like the logging company that owns that whole mountain cleared a good majority of the spots out there, including where I saw that thing. Any insight at all is greatly appreciated. Fast forward to June 2020. Corona has taken over the world. And I'm sure I've lost my mind. I forgot all about it and I'm hanging out with a friend at 3 a.m. after months of not seeing or talking to anyone, it seemed. We went out to White Castle for a quick bite. She walks out first and hits the bottom step as I'm walking out and locking the door. I hear something breaking tree limbs and crashing through them. Not fast, but not slow, and definitely noticeable. And it was coming from up high and gradually getting louder as it neared us and as it got lower. It reminded me of an orangutan or gorilla in the way it swung from each branch, and I could hear its hands gripping each one and snapping smaller limbs in its way. It was coming in our direction. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I'm crazy, until she turned around quick and was looking up high in the trees. She asked me, "Do you hear that?" I turned white and felt the air get heavier from the fear that was emanating from this thing. As I came down the stairs, she was staring into the trees, looking upwards. I glanced and saw branches moving. I yelled at her to get out of here quickly, pulling her in the direction of the car. We turned our backs to the woods when this loud thwack occurred. It landed just behind me, and all the hairs on my body stood straight up. I felt like it had a log or large, thick branch in its hand and smacked the ground with it. I stood paralyzed with fear. The air was thicker and different when whatever it was landed directly behind me. I could feel the force of it, and it brought tears to my eyes. It was the weirdest feeling to have come over me and feel like it's crushing every inch of my body without touching me. And to hurt so badly, it brought tears to my eyes and made me shake uncontrollably. And the fear it made me feel was too much to bear. Hands down one of the scariest moments I've ever encountered. I couldn't shake it. So we went to White Castles and were both shook to our cores. I'm in disbelief at what we just witnessed. We came back, turned the lights on in her car, and let them light up the woods for a good 20 minutes before we felt it was safe to go back inside. The only weapon I had in sight was a golf club. She told me she had seen it high in the trees and that it looked almost like an owl-like creature with weird features. But later on, she told me a story from when she was a teenager. She thought she was going to get taken off the back of a motorcycle by a huge owl swooping down towards her. And I told a friend about this a few months later and somehow remembered that whatever these things are, they feed off of fear. I don't know where I remember this from or why these thoughts randomly pop into my head. It's almost like something else is telling me. Since then, there's been a whole lot more weird stuff that's happened. About 6 years ago, when I was 14 years old, I was walking through the small trails throughout my parents' property that we had lived on at the time. This was a regular thing I used to do because I had just moved into the area and there were all sorts of old-fashioned farm equipment and old shacks in the woods on the property. My parents were pretty wealthy, and they had purchased well over 100 acres, they still own it to this day, of land, and there were even a few streams that ran through there as well. It was sometime in the afternoon that I was walking on this narrow path, and I noticed a golden retriever run out into the path in front of me from out of the brush. I was curious, and considering I didn't have a dog and there were not any neighbors within around 5 miles of the property, it looked at me, began to bark, and stopped in its tracks, looking at me with a very agitated look. A few moments later, a man around 19 to 20 years old comes running out of the brush and stops in his tracks. He looks really confused to see me and yells, "Hey, what are you doing here?" and starts to chase me. I instantly sprinted as fast as I could back to my house and didn't have any intent of looking back, but I heard him yelling, "Hey, wait," and the voice sounded scarily familiar. And eventually, halfway through the wooded thicket, I couldn't hear his voice anymore, and he didn't seem to be following me. However, that didn't stop me from getting back to my house as fast as possible. I told my parents this, and my stepfather actually went and retrieved the rifle from his gun safe and proceeded to go look for this guy for an hour or so before basically finding no evidence of this happening. I actually got grounded for this because they thought I was lying, and my parents, being very Christian, basically assumed it was just another tall tale from their rebellious child. Okay, now that you've made it through this part of the story, this is where it starts to get ducking absolutely weird. Around 5 weeks ago, I visited my parents' house with my girlfriend and her golden retriever Bentley. The first few hours of the visit went just fine. I talked with family, had some drinks, and enjoyed being at home for a change instead of working my daily 9 to 5 shifts. It was nice. I stepped out to let the dog out and to smoke a cigarette, and for no reason Bentley decided to dash into the woods at full speed. As fast as I could, I ran out after him into the thick woods and eventually actually lost track of him. It wasn't until about 5 minutes later, while walking into the woods, that I heard him barking at something. I quickly ran to the sound and found him no more than 15 feet away from a kid playing in the woods. I looked at him confused and said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And I started to walk towards him, and the kid booked it as fast as he could and ran through a thicket of brush and literally vanished. I've never experienced something like this, and during the moment I actually had no idea, but the kid was wearing the exact same clothes I used to wear as a 14-year-old. I've told my girlfriend about this, and even she thinks I'm ducking batshit insane, but it actually happened, and I can't explain it. Anyway, that's the story about the day I chased myself. If anyone has had any similar experiences, please tell me. There is no way I'm the only one. Arkansas, a man in Cleburne County says he and his friend came across a humanoid with a wolf head. The man specified a location, but it will remain undisclosed in this report due to privacy reasons. I have heard it moving around but haven't seen it. My buddy Dell one night could not sleep. It was around 2 a.m. He said he had a strange feeling and went to check on his horse, so he grabbed a flashlight, the 33-year-old said. Reportedly, as he approached the horse, everything seemed normal. However, he adds, when he pointed the flashlight at the edge of the woods, he noticed an unusual shape. It was sitting close to the ground, very still, but he couldn't make it until he got closer to it. So, at about 30 feet or so, he stopped and noticed it was moving, Branch explains. At first he thought it was a very big man wearing black and digging his fingers in the ground, but as he spoke to it with a very loud voice, this thing stopped what it was doing, looked at Dell, and made eye contact. He goes on to say that when his neighbor realized it was not a human being, fear came over him. He backed away from this thing. He knew it wasn't a bear or a dog, he was more of a bodybuilder with a wolf head. The man says everybody in the area thinks they are crazy or on drugs, but he has also heard the creature moving at night. I have heard it growl and seen claw marks in the trees around me. I know what I have heard, and Dell knows what he saw. This is no lie. The Dogman is a cryptid reputed to live in the northwestern quadrant of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, although other sightings have been documented in other states. This unproven creature was first reportedly spotted in 1887 by 2 lumberjacks, who described it as having a human body and a dog's head. So this happened about 2 weeks ago at my friend's cabin in the woods. It's his family cabin, and I was there with him and a bunch of his family members. Even before I went there, I had heard stories about how it was haunted and how a ghost had tried to drown his brothers when they were younger. I never really believed the stories, but something happened to change my mind. It was on my 3rd night there that it happened. The cabin has an upstairs and a downstairs, and the upstairs is where all the bedrooms are. Everyone was sitting in the living room downstairs and chatting, and I decided to go upstairs and change my contacts out for glasses, as it was late in the night. I go upstairs, and it's pitch black because some people are already asleep. I'm feeling a little creeped out as I reach for the light switch because it's taking me a little while to find it. Right as I flick the switch, I hear a door slam shut right by me, not uncommon in the cabin, but when I turn around to see, no door is shut or swinging as if it's been moved. However, what I do see is a large shadow of a man moving across the far wall. It has spiky hair in a modern style, but otherwise, it is unclear. I try to reason with myself and think that one of the guys downstairs just came up without telling me. I come downstairs, and I ask them who went up. Here's the scary thing, they said that no one went upstairs while I was up there. Also, one of the people who was asleep woke up and saw the same thing as me at the same time. They described it as a tall man in a trench coat. What did I see? A hallucination? Somehow someone's shadow got projected? Or was it someone from another dimension or a ghost? My dad's house is in the middle of the woods and was built in 2007. This house has had a lot of bad things take place in it, like my parents fighting constantly and my dad raging and being abusive towards my mom. They got divorced in 2016 while I was in my sophomore year of high school, and when my mom moved out, I enjoyed staying with her in her new home. All of my bad dreams take place at my dad's house, and everyone seems to be afraid of them when they come over. It's so weird. It's a very big 3-story house with an alarm system and an unfinished basement. The cleaning lady there told me once that when she was cleaning the house, the alarm system detected movement in the basement. Very creepy. But to get to my story, sorry for trailing off. One night about 3 months ago, I'm 19 and in my second year of college, I came to my dad's house around 9 p.m., and my dad and my stepmother were not home yet. I came inside, made myself dinner, sat with my 2 small dogs on the couch, and waited for them to get home. I eventually went upstairs to my room, took my dogs with me, and sat on my bed and played my guitar. My dogs both fell asleep on my bed, and I just sat there playing for a bit when I heard something downstairs. I immediately thought my dad was home, and I got up and went to the top of the stairs. I just heard silence, and I was like, what the duck? I called my dad, and he said they were still at dinner and hadn't left yet. So I was a little weirded out, but after like 10 minutes, I went back to just sitting on my bed and forgetting about it. Well, about 5 to 10 minutes after that, I heard 3 noises that sounded like objects falling off a table or something. I was not about to go see what happened because I'm a wuss, and I took my dogs and locked myself in the bathroom because I thought someone was in the house. I called my dad and told him to come home because I was scared, and they left the restaurant to come home. My dad also has security cameras, so he checked the cameras for me and saw nothing. After hiding in the bathroom for 30 minutes or so, he finally got home, and I came downstairs a little scared but relieved he was home. We looked all over to see if anything had fallen down, and we found nothing. It could have just been the ice maker, but it truly sounded like a bottle falling down. Well, I thought this was the end of it, and I really could have forgotten about this scary event, but I went to sleep that night around 11 p.m. I usually do not sleep this early, but I had work at 6 a.m. that morning, and I was worn out. I fell asleep with both my dogs on the bed with me, and around 1 a.m., I woke up suddenly to a warm, harsh pressure on my foot, and it felt as if it were being lifted up off my bed. My eyes were wide open, but my face was kind of covered in blankets, and I kind of just stayed under the blankets and yanked my feet. The feeling went away, and my dog jumped off the bed after I yanked my feet and started pacing around my room. I had the worst, most fearful feeling, and I truly felt like a presence was in there. It is something I have never felt before. I just started praying, and I called my dad on my phone, asking him to come up the stairs and lay with me. I was too scared to move. I then heard a really strange noise. It was almost like a low moaning noise. I really don't know how to describe it. It could have just been me in my sleep head making shit up or my dog, but it was just all too perfect for the moment. I really am not sure what to think of this. My dad came into my room, and I told him what happened. My dad and I don't have a close relationship anymore because of what has happened in the past, but he laid with me in bed and slept with me for a few hours before leaving, which was really nice and what I needed. I can't say I really slept much that night, and I have not slept at his house since, and I probably will never again, but this was the first and only time I have had something like this happen, and I conclude that it is the house and the weird ties I have to it with bad memories. I think some bad juju is flowing through there. Please let me know any thoughts on this, if any. I live in the South, so the woods were something I grew up with. I was always an outdoorsman, and I would often go climbing and exploring in the forests around where I lived. Sometimes I would go out to camp, chopping small trees, making fires, and practicing with my knives and machetes. I was never really scared of anything, to be honest, even at a young age. I always carried at least a fixed blade knife with me on my adventures, and I felt like I could take on anything that came my way. As I grew older, I didn't do this kind of thing as much, but I would go hiking quite often. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago, on a Sunday, May 3rd, I decided I would go on an afternoon hike just to enjoy being outside. I still enjoyed the woods as much as I did when I was a kid. Now I think I actually appreciate it more. My senses are calibrated a lot better these days, so I am able to take in all the scenery and nature, which just feels peaceful. This Sunday seemed just like any other, and I got into my car to drive to my hiking spot. I'm not a fan of going on official hiking trails because the linear course and other people seem to dilute the wild. My spot is pretty out of the way, about an hour from my home, and no one else would have any reason to go there. It isn't marked at all. There are no signs, no fences, no footprints, nothing. It is just endless woods for miles and miles. I parked my car a pretty good distance from where I always entered, just in case anyone came by, although the dirt road was always completely deserted. Now that I think about it, I have never seen or even heard a car or other people over there. I set off on my walk through the woods, geared with my trail running shoes, a hat, and my 6-inch engraved knife in its sheath on my belt. I strolled along my normal route to start off with an expanse of lush green in all directions. I covered about 2 miles of flat ground, climbed a 20-foot boulder wall, and traversed across a small creek. I was just taking in everything around me. The cool breath of a breeze on my back, the sound of the flowing water filling my ears, and scanning the diverse landscape for any wildlife. I continued on my favorite path. It wasn't really a path, but I knew the woods pretty well at this point. Then I got to an area where I realized I had never gone off to the left. I'm not sure why I never went that way because I had pretty much explored all other directions in the vicinity. Not taking too much time to think about it, I headed left into the uncharted horizon. After a few more miles in this new direction, I started to get a strange feeling. It was an eerie kind of feeling, like something was off. I realized I hadn't seen any animals over this way. No birds flying above, no squirrels shuffling on tree branches, not even any bugs making noises. Nothing. I brushed it off and continued my trek. I stopped here and there to examine different things, like strange markings on some of the trees, but there was nothing too exciting over here. I noticed the sun was starting to descend and the darkness was creeping in. I had completely lost track of time exploring this new place. I left my home to go on my hike a little after noon, so I had to have been out there for 5 or 6 hours. I remember thinking how strange it was that the moon was already fairly high so early in the day. Time seems to go by in a different manner when I am out in the woods. I don't know why that is. I decided it was time to head back. I would have to hurry because it would be dark soon. I turned and set off in the direction I had come from, at least I thought I was. The woods were a lot denser in this section than the others I had explored in the opposite direction, so it was a lot harder to keep track of where I was. I soon realized I was kind of lost. I must have gotten turned around somewhere. Whenever I am in the woods, even in an area I know well, I always leave a trail of some kind to guide me back. Every 30 feet or so, I would bend a branch or occasionally make an X on a tree with my knife, so it was clear I had been there. I kept trying to trace my steps, but I couldn't find any broken branches, and I was getting a bit frustrated. I never made mistakes like this, so what the hell was going on? Just then, I saw an X marked on a tree. Ah, there we go, no need to get worked up after all. I walked further, looking for more signs. Then I saw another X. Then another. And another. Alright. I definitely didn't carve that many trees, and there were still no broken branches at all. I was getting a little worried at this point. I continued on, hoping to see some form of familiarity, but I just kept seeing X markings. They were on almost every tree at this point. Now I know I had never been this far on this side before, so these markings couldn't have been for me on previous visits. Plus, I would never be so foolish as to make that many markings because it would just create confusion. I went to examine one of the markings and quickly realized that they were wider than my knife would cut and a lot deeper. That's when the feeling hit me again. That eerie sense when you know something is wrong. That feeling that you're not alone. That feeling that you're being watched. Now, like I said, I have always been pretty fearless, but I'm not stupid. There are certain situations that even a knife and good instincts can't get you out of. Still, I was determined not to show fear. Maybe if I showed whoever was ducking with me that I wasn't going to take any shit, they would show themselves or leave. The darkness was getting thicker by the minute, and I needed to get the duck out of here now. I started walking slowly in what I thought was the right direction, listening for anything abnormal. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, I finally thought I was just being paranoid and making SHT up. Then I started to hear noises. All while the consuming darkness swept over the forest. The sound started off like small sticks breaking, then the scratching of tree bark. Then leaves rustle violently, and branches are torn off trees. I looked in every direction, but it was getting harder and harder to see with night looming down fast and my eyes unadjusted. My hand gripped the hilt of my knife tight, and I started moving at a faster pace. I was getting really freaked out. The next sound came much louder than all the rest. It sounded closer. I turned to see where it was coming from. That's when I saw him. I could barely make out a dark figure in the distance. The moonlight was beaming down. It was one of the brightest moons I have ever seen. It still provided illumination through the thick canopy of trees overhead. This guy looked big. Like really big. There was no way I could take a guy that big normally. With a knife, I may have stood a chance. That is, if he wasn't armed with anything. I could see him start walking in my direction, getting closer and closer. Then I noticed that he walked in a very strange way, and I couldn't see any outline of clothing. He was covered in something. As he moved closer, I realized just how big it was. There is no way a man can be that big. There aren't any big games in the area where I live. The biggest things we have are deer and coyotes. This thing looked like the size of a bear, but I knew that was impossible. Bears didn't live anywhere near here, not even in this state. I started walking backwards, drawing my knife slowly, not wanting to take my eyes off of this thing. Just as I pulled my knife fully from the sheath, it started running full speed. On all fours. I have never run so fast in my entire life. Within seconds, my hat was off my head, falling behind me carelessly. My legs were in overdrive as I sprinted in the opposite direction of whatever animal was chasing me. I wasn't going to stop. There is no ducking way I'm going to stop, I told myself. I could hear it behind me, gaining on me with tremendous speed. I was too terrified to look over my shoulder, but I could feel it right on my heels. I started weaving through the trees, still going at full speed. This seemed to throw it off a little, like it didn't expect a good old-fashioned serpentine pattern. I felt it get a little further behind me and continued to dodge and weave through the branches and trees. The sound of branches snapping with ease was the only audible noise in my mind. I still thought I might be able to lose it. That was until I reached a clearing where a small creek stretched through the woods. Open area. Duck, I at least knew where I was now. I tore through the last of the trees and was making my way to the creek. The creek was pretty wide here, but there were some rocks dividing the water into different streams. I leapt to one rock and then to another. It was too dark to see clearly, and I was moving so fast that I didn't have time to check my surroundings appropriately. As my foot hit the second rock, I felt it slide out from under me. It felt like I was falling in slow motion, and I could clearly hear the beast right behind me. I caught myself with my free arm, but I still went face first into the water. Without a second's hesitation, I hurled myself back up and jumped out of the creek, all in one fluid motion. I honestly wasn't sure I was going to make it at this point. I could hear intense grunts and growls right on my ass as I tried to start running again. Suddenly, I couldn't go forward. Something pulled me back by my ankle. I had almost forgotten the knife clutched like a dagger in my right hand. It was like an extension of my body at this point. I spun on pure instinct as the immense force pulled me back and tried to slash with my blade. I must have been hit because my knife didn't come back as I swung my body in the other direction when the grip on my ankle was released. Then I heard the most terrifying cry, sounding like nothing I had ever heard before. It cracked through the silence of the forest, creating a void of pure terror. I said I ran faster than I ever had before, but that is not true. In this moment, I ran faster than humanly possible. I guess it was that fight or flight response people always talk about. I didn't look back once as the foul cries filled the air. I just ran. After what seemed like hours, I finally saw the break in the tree line where the dirt road was. I sprinted on fumes to my car, grabbed the keys from the back tire, and took off. As I drove off, I could still hear cries and howls in the distance, but nothing else. When I twisted my body to strike at the creature, I got a full glimpse of it. It was not a ducking bear. It was not a ducking coyote. I don't know what the duck it was. I had never seen eyes like that. I had never seen teeth like that. The image pulsed through my mind all the way home, but I made it. I made it out alive. I survived. A few years ago, I was checking out some rural land, some miles down some dirt roads off of Highway 554. Kind of between Ibique and El Rito. The land was isolated. From the time I started on the dirt roads, I saw nobody else and only a pair of houses way off in the distance. Anyway, after arriving and doing a few hours of confirming property boundaries, terrain features, etc., the sun had just about set, and I was tired from a long day. I sat down in front of a bunch of junipers, very broad and almost more like bushes of human height. After a few minutes listening to coyote howls and watching a storm cloud on the horizon, out of nowhere I heard a loud and deep, I can't emphasize enough how deep it was, growl behind me. It was really startling, and it sounded like it came from just on the other side of the trees from me. I jumped up and turned around, but I couldn't see anything due to how dense the trees were. I walked in reverse all the way back to my truck and didn't look away from the source. Getting back to the truck, I didn't waste any time leaving, but due to my rushing and the intense darkness now that it was night, I got semi-lost on the dirt roads as I made my way back to the highway. Eventually I made it out, but I still don't know what that was. From how loud and deep it sounded, my first thought was a bear, but from my understanding, it's not normal for them to wander that far down from the mountains and far from any water, where I was. It also doesn't fit the behavior. I had already been in the area for a long time, making plenty of noise and even in the exact spot that the noise later came from. Black bears tend to be pretty timid and normally show aggression as a defense response, but whatever that was would have had to come up behind me already knowing I was there, just a growl from a few feet away. Very weird all around. I currently live in central Illinois, but I was born and raised in New Jersey, in the Pine Barrens. Growing up there, we had all heard stories of encounters with the Jersey Devil. My grandma had an encounter with my dad. Pretty much anyone who has ever lived there knows someone who has claimed to have seen this creature. Now I even have a former boss who staged a prank on his friend that ended up getting reported as a Jersey Devil sighting back in the 70s. He never told his friend it was all a prank, so I think that is still an official sighting in the books. Even after hearing all these stories growing up, I was never afraid to come across him. He was always portrayed as a shy, somewhat benign creature. He was never aggressive, and he was always visible enough for the person to just catch a glimpse of him. I always felt sorry for him in some way. He always seemed to lead such a lonely existence. Anyhow, I spent my childhood years riding around on my four-wheeler in his territory with no more fear of coming across the Jersey Devil than I would coming across a poorly concealed corpse dumped by the mob. Flash forward to my teen years. I'm working on a blueberry farm in Horton State Forest with my brother's girlfriend, Janice. She didn't have a driver's license at the time, so I usually ended up driving her back and forth to work every day. We usually worked well past dinner time, and this particular story took place in the early days of fall. That evening, as I was dropping her off at her house, it was a few hours after sunset. The farm we worked on was pretty deep in the middle of nowhere, and the farm she lived on was even deeper in the middle of nowhere. To get to her house, we had to drive through some pretty thick forest on gravel roads with no streetlights. It would freak anyone out, I suppose, but I was used to driving through the dark woods, so it was never anything that really bothered me. I got Janice safely to her house, went inside and exchanged some pleasantries with her parents, and then shortly made my way home. I was on the last stretch of road before the main highway that would take me to the end of town. That's when I was overcome with the creepiest feeling. I can't describe it any other way than that, it just felt like I was being watched. So, like the dumb I am, I stopped the car. My doors were locked, and I had a big wrench under my seat. I knew how to swing it to make it hurt if I needed to. I'm still in Jersey, after all. So I'm sitting there scanning the road ahead of me, and I can't really see anything other than the 30 to 40-year-old blueberry bushes on either side of the road. If you let blueberry bushes grow wild, they'll climb to a pretty astonishing height. With these tall bushes lining the road, I really couldn't see too far into the forest around me. After looking for a few seconds, I popped back into the car and put it back into gear. I slowly started pulling down the road again. That's when I noticed movement at the top of one of these tall bushes. I stopped the car again and immediately started staring in that direction. Once I focused my eyes, I could clearly see something very large crouching on the top of the one blueberry bush. I couldn't make out any details as far as colors or facial and body details, but it was something clearly silhouetted against the bright starry sky. What I could make out was something larger than a man with a huge head, sitting in a half-crouch position, almost like it was ready to spring from its hind legs. I sat and stared at her for what seemed like an eternity. I was baffled at how something that big could sit on top of a blueberry bush like that. As I said before, these bushes were old and tall, but not very sturdy. They grow almost like a garden hedge, so anything couldn't possibly be sitting on top of them without breaking the branches and tearing the bushes all to heck. In my concentration while staring at whatever was in the bushes, I accidentally let my foot slip from the clutch, and my car stalled the engine. Such a stupid move. I can honestly tell you that I came very close to almost pooping my pants right then and there. This is the wrong move. In any horror movie, you don't let your car die in the middle of the woods while some creature is stalking you. Anyway, I think the sound of my car startled me because this thing's head whipped around to stare right at me. Just as it took off in one swift motion, it was gone from my sight. As it was taking off, I didn't exactly see any wings on its back, but I heard a loud whooshing noise like large wings would make. In addition to hearing this, I could make out some very powerful looking legs that were bent at the knees like a horse's legs would be. It used them and the assumed wings on its back to disappear from my sight in a second. Since the car was now stalled and quiet, I could hear a loud screech and whoosh of air above me that grew fainter within seconds. Whatever this thing was, it was fast and it was powerful. I know I weirdly kept talking about these blueberry bushes, but I swear they are important to the story. As this creature was taking off from me, those bushes almost bent in half as it jumped off of them, and I sat there watching them thrash and sway for quite a few moments after the creature was gone. Whatever was up there was skilled enough to sit on there without breaking the branches but powerful enough to get them crashing around like crazy once it leapt off of them. Needless to say, I freaked the hell out, got the car started, threw it back into gear, and swung around the road, heading back to the safety of Janice's house, all within moments of this thing screeching away from me. I must have looked like a crazy person. When I showed back up at their house, I drove over the railway ties in their driveway, left my driver's side door open, and just barged into these people's house. I started babbling to Janice's dad about what I'd just seen, and he calmly told me, I must have just seen the Jersey Devil. He drove with me back to the spot where I'd seen it, and it confirmed there was definitely a disturbance in the bushes on that side of the road. He told me that he'd had quite a few sightings of the Jersey Devil on his land before, but he had never said anything to his wife or daughters so they wouldn't get freaked out. Needless to say, I let the cat out of the bag on it, but he really didn't seem to mind. I think he was happy to have someone else bolster his own sightings on the land. I've never officially reported this sighting to date, but it did earn me a bit of a badge of courage among the locals for being dumb enough to stop and stare at a creature in the dark woods all by myself.